Hi everyone. Good to see you on my channel today. Today I will tell you a wonderful story. It is full of love and kindness. I hope you enjoy it and I wish you an enjoyable viewing experience. Thank you.
When the newlyweds left the registry office, nature itself seemed to welcome them. Half an hour ago it was pouring dreary rain, and now suddenly a friendly sun shone, and even the puddles, which had not had time to dry out, already looked cheerful. More precisely, the mirrors scattered everywhere, reflecting the clear blue sky and tender spring leaves on the trees, looked festively bright, as if the whole world had washed and beautified itself for their sake. "Isn't it beautiful?" cheerfully remarked the young bride, who had just become a lawful wife. She was not dressed in a white wedding gown, but in an ordinary, and also quite inexpensive dress. But what did it matter when the girl's eyes shone with love and happiness? "Why, you are a poet, Emily," whistled the young husband admiringly. "Why, that's a beautiful thing to say." The thin wedding ring beat off a ray of sunlight on her finger. Emily raised her hand and laughed joyously. "You know," she said, snuggling up to her lover, "I never noticed before that ordinary engagement rings like this could be so beautiful. It's beautiful, isn't it?" "It is," he smiled. "Now you and I have something important to do." Michael took his wife's hand, kissing the palm of her hand. "Let's go meet my mom." "You're related now, aren't you?" The girl's smile faded immediately, as if a cold wind had snuffed out the candle's flame. "I'm afraid," she confessed. "Bridge of what?" Emily bit her lip and fell silent. "Come on," her husband encouraged. "What is it?" Emily looked up at him. "Glad I read about your mom on the internet. She has a social life, jewelry, all sorts of events." "And what's wrong with that?" Michael asked. Getting into the car, she sat next to him and shook her head thoughtfully. "No, nothing wrong, but she's different, isn't she?" "Very different." He stroked Emily's hand affectionately. He felt sorry for her. What's there to be afraid of, honestly? So what if it's different lifestyles? It doesn't matter at all. Mom's just like mom. Opposites attract. He winked, at least if science doesn't lie. "So, shall we go?" Emily sighed. "Well, let's give it a try." The car stopped in front of a tall wrought iron fence, behind which they could see a luxurious mansion, 3 stories high with elaborate tracery and tall windows, with an alley leading to the front door of the villa, lined with rose bushes in full bloom and scattered with large white buds. "Beautiful," Emily sighed admiringly. "How well tended are the roses?" "Yeah, they're Mom's favorite variety," Michael nodded. "I forget what they're called, don't I? We'll ask her just the same." "Yes, Mom." The girl faded again. "What's the matter again, Emily?" "Nothing. I just think maybe we should have met earlier." The girl looked sadly at her simple dress. "You know, I bought this dress a year ago at a sale for 500 rubles and thought I was very lucky." "It's a nice, great dress." Her husband supported her. "And it suits you very well." Emily sighed. "I thought so too. And now I saw this house here where your mother lives, and suddenly I felt that you can't pay just 500 rubles in it. You see, in my world I'm well dressed. And in your mom's world, I'll probably end up a ragamuffin." Michael laughed as Dember. "Well, if that's the case, we can buy you a new dress right now. Would you like one?" No, Emily frowned. "Why would I want to pretend to be someone else? I'm just me. I'm just afraid my mom won't accept me and say, 'Here's this ragamuffin trying to fit in with a rich family.'" "Oh, come on," Michael reassured her. "Mom's a smart woman. She didn't grow up in a cradle of gold either. And I didn't tell you. And yet." "All right," he decided, "get out from behind the wheel. Let me go alone first, talk to my mother, get her ready, and then I'll come back for you." "Well, wait for me then. I'll be right back." Emily nodded. The footsteps died down behind the fence. Then she heard the front door slam, and the second she heard it, she wanted to jump out of the car and run for her life. She had no business being here. She was out of her league. Jennifer Smith was having a rough day. She'd just gotten home from a massage. Usually she was on wings after a session like this, but not today. "Jenny, bring me some herbal tea," she tossed to the housekeeper as she passed the kitchen. "Right away, Mrs. Smith." The housekeeper did not hear the reply. She went up to her room and sank into a chair in front of her dressing table. "Why is everything so unfair?" she thought. It would seem that she had lived wisely, but she had fallen in like a fool. I'm the stupidest person in the world. Maybe it's because I've never done anything stupid, she thought with an almost superstitious fear. What if she had broken some laws of the universe? After all, a person should not only be guided by reason, but also do something stupid at least once in a while. She wrinkled her forehead, trying to remember. Had she never ever given in to her feelings? Had she ever done anything she would regret? I don't think so. But unless you counted one silly affair in her youth at 17, when the sky was high and piercingly blue from the smell of blossoming apple trees, she was dizzy. The boy corresponded to all the dreams of a romantically inclined girl, who did not accept courtship because all her suitors were something wrong. What a bunch of nerds, thought young Jennifer. And they're all so handsome, and just waiting for the moment to move to the main, from their point of view, the expression of sympathy, horizontal. Young Jennifer was sick of these insolent men. She wanted something romantic, tender, and awe-inspiring, something that would make her heart sink. That must be why she saw in the beggar street artist her dream come true. Jennifer Smith smiled, remembering their first meeting. The spring drops were ringing outside, the sun was shining, and it was so joyful and fresh that it seemed as if she were about to lift herself off the ground and fly into the air, light and swift as a bird. She did not notice the young artist sitting on a chair, who was watching her with a smile, nor would she have noticed if he had not called out. "Wait, I have to draw you." She frowned, ready to lash out at him but couldn't. The gray eyes were too welcoming, the wide smile too disposing. "I don't have any money," she warned, just in case. "I don't need any," he replied nonchalantly and leaned over his notepad. 10 minutes later, Jennifer was already holding a quick pencil sketch of a thin girl walking down a spring street. Except if you look closely, she wasn't touching the ground. "You like it," he smiled. "That's how I saw you." She didn't answer. He understood her mood. Read it like an open book, captured the movement of her soul, saw the invisible. "What's your name?" John asked. He was young and handsome, like a young god. Or maybe it only seemed that way. And what could it matter when it was springtime? "And you, young and beautiful," he said. "And when your head is spinning with love, and he is your one and only, also desperately in love with you." Everything was so beautiful. The looks they exchanged, the pounding of their hearts, the slight discharge of electricity as they held hands in hands. Oh my God, he was taking her hand, not reaching for some more seductive part of her body. He was really taking his time. And in gratitude for this delicacy, the girl's heart melted like a spring in the bright sunshine. Did they have leisurely walks in the evening city? The artist read some inexpressibly beautiful poems and gently squeezed her palm, and she would also come to visit him. He lived in a communal apartment with wooden floors, huge windows, and narrow winding corridors. Not quite sober neighbors were always wandering through these corridors, but somehow it didn't annoy him at all. Because there, behind the shabby door of the second door on the left, there was real magic. Jennifer took off her sandals, slapping barefoot on the warm floor. The painter was always busy, only taking a second away from his easel to nod. Jennifer sat with her feet on the windowsill and waited patiently for her lover to take a break. He shoved an old mug of iced green tea into her hands. She'd never tasted anything so delicious before. The mug's handle was chipped, and Jennifer ran her fingertips over the cracked areas, feeling every indentation. Finally, it was time for a break. The sheets were quickly becoming damp from the heat in their heated bodies. Then Annie swayed in sweet exhaustion while he moved her hair and told her stories, sometimes sad, sometimes funny. And the heat rose little by little, and the interminably long day folded into twilight. And Jennifer's heart snapped at the thought that perhaps it would soon be over, their honeymoon dragging day without time. She hadn't mentioned that she'd traveled to the capital just a month ago to try her luck at a modeling agency. The girl had been in that crazy city for a week, running from one casting call to another, and now she was waiting for an invitation. Of course, no one promised her anything, but deep down Jennifer had no doubt she would be invited. And this feeling of imminent separation strengthened her love, gave it some painful sharpness, and the invitation came. Jennifer packed her things and stopped by the artist's house on the way to the train station. She didn't feel like a long goodbye. He looked at the travel bag in surprise. I have a train in 2 hours, Jennifer said. I've been called to work for a modeling agency, so I thought I'd go. Well, he stretched out thoughtfully. It'll be better for you that way. You'll have a business you love. And for you, 1,000 times she had promised herself not to ask him that question, but she couldn't help herself. Would it be better for you too? He smiles. I have my pencils and paints. That's quite a lot, as it may seem. I see, Jennifer replied, though she didn't really understand anything except that he was okay with her leaving. Plain gratitude for this delicacy made the girl's heart melt like a fontanelle in the bright sunshine. Did they have leisurely walks in the evening city? The artist read some inexpressibly beautiful poems and gently squeezed her palm in it. She also came to visit him. He lived in a communal apartment with wooden floors, huge windows, and narrow winding corridors. Not quite sober neighbors were always wandering through these corridors, but somehow it didn't annoy him at all. Because there, behind the shabby door of the second door on the left, there was real magic. Jennifer took off her sandals, slapping barefoot on the warm floor. The painter was always busy, only taking a second away from his easel to nod. Jennifer sat with her feet on the windowsill and waited patiently for her lover to take a break. He shoved an old mug of iced green tea into her hands. She'd never tasted anything so delicious before. The mug's handle was chipped, and Jennifer ran her fingertips over the cracked areas, feeling every indentation. Finally, it was time for a break. The sheets were quickly becoming damp from the heat in their heated bodies. Then Annie swayed in sweet exhaustion, while he moved her hair and told her stories, sometimes sad, sometimes funny. And the heat rose little by little, and the interminably long day folded into twilight. And Jennifer's heart snapped at the thought that perhaps it would soon be over, their honeymoon dragging day without time. She hadn't mentioned that she'd traveled to the capital just a month ago to try her luck at a modeling agency. The girl had been in that crazy city for a week, running from one casting call to another, and now she was waiting for an invitation. Of course, no one promised her anything, but deep down Jennifer had no doubt she would be invited. And this feeling of imminent separation strengthened her love, gave it some painful sharpness, and the invitation came. Jennifer packed her things and stopped by the artist's house on the way to the train station. She didn't feel like a long goodbye. He looked at the travel bag in surprise. I have a train in 2 hours, Jennifer said. I've been called to work for a modeling agency, so I thought I'd go. Well, he stretched out thoughtfully. It'll be better for you that way. You'll have a business you love. And for you, 1,000 times she had promised herself not to ask him that question, but she couldn't help herself. Would it be better for you too? Adventures. I have my pencils and paints. That's quite a lot, as it may seem. I see, Jennifer replied, though she didn't really understand anything except that he was okay with her leaving, and that was a shame. She pulled a small box out of her bag. Here, take this, she said, a parting gift. It's a new mug. Thank you. I don't have a gift for you. It's not like I didn't know. And you give me the old one. The girl smiled. The one I used to drink tea out of. Then he made green tea again from that very mug. But for some reason, her favorite drink was not as delicious as before, and the new life was no longer so enticing. Where to? Modeling career suddenly seemed just a deceptive gloss in which was wrapped in emptiness. There was nothing inside, nothing that could be called. That's what it seemed to her. Left in that room, she walked barefoot in the bright streaks of sunlight on the floor, in the quiet voice of someone who made up stories for her. That was it. The real thing. At the modeling agency, she was greeted coolly. The principal, a well-groomed, dry lady in a business suit, was able to look the girl over from head to toe. Sighing, she shook her head. Jennifer waited in silence. So then, the lady announced her verdict. You shouldn't think you got the invitation because we're all friendly here, all swooning over your beauty. You are far from Naomi Campbell, and on the pale shadow of Claudia Schiffer also do not pull. But if you don't act like a fool, you'll have a good chance. Do you have potential? Thank you, Jennifer said. What do I have to do? The CEO grinned. She had very white teeth and glasses with that frame. It made her face seem somehow predatory. But you're always fat. How much do you weigh now? 48 pounds. That's a lot. You'll always weigh 2 pounds more than you need to. Internalize that right away because of the nature of the job. Understand? Second, in the modeling business, no one will babysit you. There are a million people like you, with more or less correct facial features. So I don't advise you to be capricious and overdo it. They'll tell you to go as a promoter to the presentation of a new brand of margarine, so there. They say go to a lingerie fashion show, so there. And 3, you'll get in. It depends a lot on you. You'll be a rich celebrity. If you don't, you'll live forever on pennies, and sometimes not even pennies. That's your choice. Now, do you want to work for us or not? If you say you do, we'll sign the contract. If you don't, get out. Jennifer looked down at her arms and legs, which were as thin as twigs. Where else was there to lose weight? You're always fat. If she lost another 2 pounds, she'd be winded. But advertising margarine, isn't that what she dreamed of? Not to mention going to a fashion show in her underwear. Who's going to be watching? Fat men with oily looks. I'm out of here, she said, and quickly, so she wouldn't have time to change her mind, walked out the door. Just like that, in one fell swoop, she was done with foolishness and romance, with first love and ambitious girlhood dreams. But everything was normal from then on. I entered the Faculty of Foreign Languages. I got a job at a reputable firm, and married without much love on calculation, but with sympathy. By the age of 30, she gave birth to her only child and never went to work again. Her husband was a rich man, the kind who sometimes marries humble translators. Who knows why? Maybe because they have everything, and they do not need the love of recognized beauties. They've had enough. When her husband died suddenly of a heart attack, Jennifer did not feel a particular loss of a spouse with whom she lived for almost 24 years. She did not even have time to get attached. He was always away at work. Jennifer could not remember a single vacation, a single weekend that they would spend together. When he died, she became the heiress to $1 million fortune. That, at least, was how it seemed. But the illusion, as sometimes happens, was shattered by the harsh reality. Suddenly, it turned out that her late husband had been dodging money from the IRS, and he had accumulated so many debts that once they were paid off, one could forget about a comfortable life. While the lawyers sorted out the tangled affairs, the widow locked herself in the house. Spent a week in bed with a cold compress on her forehead. Everything fell apart. Everything. And the worst of it was that there was no strength at all to pull herself together, to try to figure things out on her own, to get out of bed. Jennifer dialed the number of her therapist. I need counseling, she exhaled. Maybe even a phone one, but I really need it. After listening to her rambling story, the connoisseur of human souls asked only one question. What do you personally want? Jennifer hesitated. Honestly, she admitted, it's embarrassing to even say, inappropriate somehow. And yet I want to go somewhere by the sea, and not think about anything for at least a few days. When she said it aloud, the wish ceased to seem so ridiculous. Do you think I'm allowed to go away? You should, rather. Within hours, Jennifer was already sitting in the cabin of an airplane. A week at sea might not solve anything, maybe, or even for sure, but at least it would help calm things down. She discreetly dropped her shoes and stretched out her legs. Stewardess obligingly leaned over. Perhaps you need a plate or a sleep mask. She hated to admit it, even to herself, but she was lying about something. In telling her about her desire to leave, she had left something else out. After the death of her husband, after all the problems with her inheritance, Jennifer Smith suddenly had an unbearable desire to love and be loved. It seemed to her that there could not be a more absurd desire. But coffee was served. Jennifer Smith gave herself a moment's reflection and concluded that her desire was quite normal. After all, she had never felt so defenseless as she did now. And more than anything else, she wanted someone strong to hold her and say, "Don't worry, I'll take care of it." Jennifer Smith sighed. Alas, such a man was not around and was not expected. She had no complaints about the lack of male attention. But it was just as it had been so many years ago in her youth, although perhaps not like then. But even more cynical, more evil. For some reason, her current suitors didn't want a quarter, but immediately and directly offered to continue acquaintance in the bedroom. They were genuinely surprised when Jennifer Smith suggested to get to know each other better. And what's the drag? Surprised one of her fans. We're not children, we're adults. Already you would think that since adults, everything is reduced to a mere manifestation of the flesh. Particularly desperate suitors immediately after acquaintance began to make plans for a joint life. Those attracted by money, and they did not even give themselves a labor to hide their mercantile interests. Jennifer Smith didn't know what was worse. The current awkward advances of guys who responded so strongly in her youth seemed almost touching. Maybe because as the years passed, all the unpleasantness faded from memory. "There is no happiness in life," she whispered earnestly. But life prepared a pleasant surprise, which Jennifer Smith could not have expected. The first night she heard about a beach party and decided to go there to unwind. She wanted the music, the dancing, the glow of a bonfire at night. Going to the beach, Jennifer Smith put on a light white dress and a couple of favorite jewelry. The night beach and the big southern stars, the melodic chiming of guitar strings, the cheerful tiny world she needed so much right now. No sooner had she gotten close to the dancers than someone grabbed her arm and immediately dragged her away. Jennifer Smith laughed as she danced, the scarlet glow of the fire flickering in her eyes, casting a warm glow on the skin and hair of the dancers, rhythmically changing tune after tune, the last one slow and gentle. Someone touched Jennifer Smith's shoulder lightly. "May I?" he said softly, and she laughed and gave him both hands. Jason, the artist, wasn't the same man he'd been before. The years hadn't chopped his features but made them more masculine. His gaze was still as clear and direct, but now it had the gentle wisdom of a man who had seen much but had not lost his kindness. He drew her to him, and Jennifer Smith did not want to resist. She clung to him as if he were the nearest and dearest person in the world. "What are you doing here?" she asked, swaying in his arms to the beat of the music. Nothing much, just relaxing." "Is this my party?" Yeah, he shrugged nonchalantly. "I come here once a year and have this party on the beach at night. People have fun, get to know each other, and you can just come and dance and forget about everything for a while." "That's just me," Jennifer Smith sighed. Jason smelled of the sea, of thunderstorms, and of some elusive but marvelous perfume. She wanted to nuzzle her nose into his neck, close her eyes, and breathe in that magical mixture of scents. As if he sensed it, he put his palms on the back of her neck and pulled her to him. "What do you want to forget?" he asked. But didn't want to answer. It was so good to be silent, to breathe, to live this moment. But the question was asked. "My husband died," she answered reluctantly. "And then it turned out that he had enormous debts. And if I paid them off, I'd be left with nothing." Jason was silent for a moment. "How much did he owe?" "It doesn't matter," she mumbled, pulling herself tighter. "Don't ask." "I already asked," he insisted softly. "A word is not a sparrow." Jennifer Smith lifted her head and, with her lips just touching his ear, said the amount. Well, she grinned. "Is it impressive?" She expected to see incomprehension, consternation in his eyes. But something was wrong. He was smiling calmly and brightly, as if he had heard some nonsense not worthy of attention. "Why are you smiling?" she asked angrily. "Does it amuse you so much?" "I'm sorry, honey. I'm not laughing. I'm rejoicing," Jason said. "For your problems." Jennifer Smith shook her head. "I'm glad that I can get you out of trouble," he said. "What? What are you talking about?" Jennifer Smith whispered in amazement. "I'm saying I'll pay off all my debts tomorrow. Don't you worry about that. Now let's dance some more." Jennifer Smith pulled away from him and looked closely and sternly into his eyes, trying to find a shadow of mockery in them. "Jason, who are you? You used to be a poor artist, and now you say—" He put his arm around her shoulders and laughed softly. "Let's go sit down and have a drink. Apparently I have a lot to tell you." They moved away from the dancers toward the sea. Jason took a flat flask out of his pocket. "It's rum. Will you have some?" She took a sip and didn't regret it. The rum was deliciously smooth, with a tart aftertaste. "Cherry." Jennifer Smith smiled. "Tasty. Then it's also listenable." "When you left, I almost drank myself to death," Jason began. "But you let me go so easily." Jennifer Smith smiled slyly. "Why?" He shrugged, keeping his gaze on the dark sea. "You wanted to be a model to shine. When a man wants something so passionately, you have to let him try. I loved you, but I didn't want to tie you down." Jason ruffled his graying hair. "It was painful to tear you from my heart. Honestly, I don't know if I would have gotten drunk. But then disaster struck. My father collapsed after a bad accident. So I rushed over to help him. Actually, he had 3 of us sons. I was the youngest. We all took care of my father together. We were on duty at his bedside, fed him, changed his clothes. We took turns doing whatever we needed to do. But, you see, my older brothers were already married. They had their own boys growing up. So I suggested they go back to their families. And I, as the priest, stayed with my dad. I didn't leave him for a year. My brothers came too, but less often. And it's quite natural. A year later, Dad passed away. Jason was silent for a moment. The waves lapped at the shore, and it seemed to be the only sound left in the silent world. My father was not a poor man, Jason continued, and he left us a good inheritance. But my brothers gave up their share in my favor and decided I deserved it more than they did, because I took care of Daddy until the day he died. That's how I became a wealthy man. But I didn't want to just spend the money, of course. I wanted to put the money to work, to multiply it eventually, and to thank my brothers for their generosity. You realize such selflessness is rare. Sometimes family members are willing to cut each other's throats for money. But here, no one took a penny for themselves. They gave it all to me. I decided to take a risk and open a coffee shop. There weren't many of them back then, and mine became an instant hit. Then I opened a second, a third, and now I own a thriving chain. Our food is always delicious. Our prices are reasonable, and we cater to people of all classes, not just the select few. And painting? Jennifer Smith asked. Willingly for the soul, Jason smiled. Art isn't very lucrative, at least not for everyone. I don't know how to make a profit from it. Maybe it's for the best. What do you think, Annie? Jennifer Smith ran her arms around his neck. I don't think anything, she whispered. Nothing. The 2 weeks at the seaside flew by like a dream. Jennifer Smith flew on wings of peace and happiness. Her inheritance had been saved, and at last the man she loved was at her side. Now it was possible to breathe easy, to enjoy what life so graciously bestowed. She'd even decided to introduce her son to Jason, only by video link, of course. But they would meet again when she returned. We won't be separated when it's time to leave, will we? Jason asked. Or are we just having a little vacation romance? I don't want to break up, she said simply. But the idyll ended, as always, abruptly. Jason came to her room that morning, and Jennifer Smith knew immediately that something bad had happened. His eyes were too sad and his face too pale and lost. What's wrong? She asked. He shook his head as if trying to collect his thoughts. Yes, trouble. Brandon, my older brother. He passed away today, pneumonia. I knew he was sick, but I thought, anyway, I'm going to have to go to the funeral. But not only that. You see, Brandon has a child out of wedlock. I was the only one who knew about it. My brother always took care of him, though. It's a complicated story. The girl's mother died early, and Brandon. He knew his wife would never accept another man's. He had to agree to keep the girl in an orphanage, but he always took care of her. Now I have to find her because I'm her uncle. Sometimes he didn't think about it. Was Michael really such a good guy? Or was it just a deliberate way of dealing with everyone and always being nice and get his little and big benefits from it? That's the kind of person the waiters save the best tables for. And flight attendants carefully offer a second plaid, but it probably wasn't that. Michael, unlike his cold-hearted mother, was warm and compassionate. It's his nature, and thank God for that. Opening the door to his mother's room, Michael squeezed his eyes shut. White always made his eyes hurt in here. Everything was white. The floor was covered with an off-white carpet. There were white vases on a white table. The peonies, by the way, were white and pink, and Michael tried to look exactly at them, the only colored spot in this snowy realm of style and purity. His mother came out of the bathroom and smiled discreetly when she saw her. Hello, Michael. Is there something you wanted to tell me? Have a seat. Michael glanced fearfully at the white upholstery of the chairs. White noise. Honestly, it was kind of scary to sit on that. For some reason, it seems that your clothes are dirty, although of course they're not, and you're bound to get it all dirty. Yes, I won't be long, he said. I just wanted to tell you that you're going to meet a nice person soon. Jennifer Smith climbed into the chair with her legs tucked up. She had knees of unprecedented beauty. It's rare for a girl to have them. And who was this person? She asked. Endinshire. Your daughter-in-law. And in the near future, she will be the mother of your grandson. So be nice to her, please. She's very shy and in general. So she's a little apprehensive about making this acquaintance. But we'll try. You're crazy. Jennifer Smith was in her usual role, a perplexed raised eyebrow and contempt in her voice. That was all her indignation. And if you're going to get married, you should have asked my opinion. Michael suddenly thought he'd never seen his mother truly humanly angry. Normal people might blush with anger, not scowl. It's not a pretty sight, but it's natural. It is clear that the person in front of you, not an emotionless machine, but with Jennifer this never happened. The image of a flawless lady, the one who does not waste time on such trifles as emotions, completely absorbed her and completely eradicated the usual human weaknesses. Mother, you've always loved an independent character. What's wrong with raising me that way? I work, I provide for myself. My mother stood up and paced the room nervously. Independence and recklessness are different things, Michael. You're the heir to everything I have, my entire fortune, and you don't know everything. It cost me some effort to hold on to what we have, and we could have lost everything. Absolutely everything. And just when I was calming down, just when I was breathing freely, you show up and tell me that you've decided to start a family. What's wrong with that? Nothing. But in this case, I have the right to know in advance who you plan to share the inheritance with. Isn't that right? Right, he admitted it reluctantly. But you'd be against taking some orphanage girl as your wife. How's that? Do you realize what she's interested in the first place? She loves me, she loves me, she loves me, but not you. And she loves a guy from a rich family, a guy who drives a new car and flies to Paris on the weekends just because he wanted to walk in the Latin Quarter. Now tell me, if you were a pauper, would she love you as much? He walked to the door, but it's a pointless conversation. So are you ready to meet your sister-in-law? If not, let's postpone the meeting to a more appropriate time. Jennifer Smith let out a long sigh. God be with you. Lead the way. Let's see who you've chosen for yourself. Of course, she didn't want to see her new daughter-in-law at all. But since it had been such a terrible day, full of disappointment, she'd let her stay. She just hoped it was the last of her troubles for the day. Her son left and Jennifer collapsed back into her chair, angry and exhausted. What on earth was this attack? Some kind of orphan invasion. Jason rushed off to find some bastard niece, and the son brought a vagrant into the house, to whom congratulations. Now his wife. Funny, can't you see what all those poor orphans are thinking? Jennifer herself, having left her hometown, cut off ties with her family forever. They were too cramped and simple for her, and it was important for her to seem like a real aristocrat. How else would she hook up with a millionaire husband? There was no point in introducing her family to him. And then, once they found out that she was a rich woman, they would all be sure to start begging her for money. That would have been too bad. It was easier to forget them forever. Emily entered the room timidly, keeping her hands in her husband's. Hey. Hello, Jennifer Smith. Without rising from her chair, she nodded stately. Go. Good evening, please. Michael smiled and pushed his wife forward. Emily looked down at the snow-white, clean carpet with horror. I'm straight from the street. I'll get it dirty. She bent down, quickly unlaced her sneakers, and walked barefoot across the carpet. A faint grin appeared on Jennifer Smith's lips. This girl's upbringing was a mess. Taste, too. Her gaze immediately noted the girl's unnaturally long eyelashes and overdone manicure. She must have done it for some holiday, but to get rid of it all at once is neither the smartest nor the money. Maybe it's in honor of the wedding. Mike. She turned to her son. Would you excuse us for a moment? I promise you I'll be white and fluffy. No, I won't, Emily replied. I'm very worried. So no, I'm not worried, Emily said. I'm, on the contrary, I'm all right. Dim, Jennifer Smith, Michael winked conspiratorially at his sister-in-law. That's what female solidarity means. Go, and Emily and I will talk about our own female. Well, he shrugged. Then I'll probably walk for an hour and that'll be enough for you. Well, of course, son. Jennifer Smith smiled honeyedly, left alone with her daughter-in-law. Jennifer looked long and silently at her guest. The disappointment wasn't total. Actually, knowing something about Mike's tastes, one could assume that he was enchanted by some young nymph with the features of a grenadier beauty, or at the very least a shabby, low-key, but viciously beautiful dancer. Emily had neither freckles nor teddy bear eyes. Snub nose, inappropriate lipstick. Cheap. What was Michael falling for? Was it the cleavage and the round ass? That's ridiculous. The pause was getting longer. And Jennifer Smith was deliberately stretching it out, taking a strange, sadistic pleasure in seeing Emily and her confusion. The girl clapped her eyelashes together pitifully. She'll cry with disgust in a minute, Jennifer thought, and Mary will stain the upholstery with her cheap makeup. Gross. So how long has it been? She finally asked. Emily flinched. What? When did Michael and I meet? No, Jennifer grumbled. I'm asking about that. She gestured squeamishly at the girl's stomach. What's the time frame? 3 months, I think. The doctor said 6 weeks. Jennifer Smith heaved a sigh of relief. I forgive a lot of things, but this is too much. How long do you want? What? No, she's a fool after all. The mother-in-law couldn't stand it. Let's say how much you want and call it a day. Don't think I'm going to weep with mortification that my only son wanted you. I don't want anything, and I'm not going to have an abortion. Michael and I want this baby. No, girl, it's not like that. You're the one who wants this baby so that you can take possession of the Johnsons' fortune later. Michael, you can cheat, but me, you can't. But I'm warning you, you don't get me out of your life. And I'll immediately rewrite my will, give everything to charity, just so long as it's not to you. What nonsense, you say? The girl shrugged and headed for the door. And Michael? Michael thinks you're a smart woman. Okay, stop. Jennifer Smith grabbed her purse, jerked it open, and change, keys, lipstick, and bank cards spilled onto the carpet. She picked up the card, walked over to Emily, and shoved it forcefully into her hand. There's $100,000 here. That's enough for an abortion at any clinic. You can spend all the money, you don't have to pay anything back. But just get out of our family life. You don't know him. And I've known him since birth. He'll run away from you himself in a month or two at most, but then you'll be left with nothing, no money and no shame. That's what you think. Now go away. We have nothing to talk about. She turned away to the window. Emily, without a word, went out quietly. Michael sat in a coffee shop not far from the house. He liked this place. It was always quiet, cozy, and the aroma of fresh baked goods was associated with the warmth of home. It was a nice, warm place, and when he met the owner of the chain, he liked it even more. Jason Anderson turned out to be a cordial friend of his mother's and a great person, though perhaps Michael's judgment was superficial. After all, they had only crossed paths a couple times. Truthfully, Michael never realized what the pair had in common. It was hard to imagine two people more unsuited to each other. Spring cold, beautiful Jennifer living in her crystal white world, and Jason, so earthy. Michael, is that you? He heard a sonorous male voice and turned around. Jason was already walking toward him, smiling broadly. Well, we meet again. Would you like some coffee? Yeah, that's what I came for. Were you going to your mom's? Jason grinned sadly. I'm afraid not, Michael. Your mom and I broke up. Oh, really? Yes? You don't have to try to be tactful. I'm here because I just got off the plane burying my brother. I'm sorry, Jason. I didn't know. Yeah, that kind of thing. The man sighed. You see, I needed to find one more person, and it turned out I needed to look in this very town. So I got back earlier than I planned. He bit his lip, and his eyes became moist. Michael didn't know what to say, but it was awkward to look at Jason now. Strong people don't like other people's stares in moments of weakness. Emily stepped outside and greedily inhaled the air. What was she saying? This nightmarish, cold, beautiful woman. Did she really think her son was going to be tricked for an inheritance? Emily, though raised in an orphanage, had never considered herself destitute or self-serving. For one thing, she had a father. She never saw him, but she received letters and gifts from him. In his letters, he apologized for not being able to take Emily to live with him. He knew his wife would not accept the girl. Emily took no offense. The letters were enough for her. It proved that she wasn't a complete orphan. She was an adult. She got a profession as a manicurist. Of course, a manicurist is not a high-paying job in a salon. Not a brilliant career, but she made an honest living and didn't complain. And she fell in love with her Michael before she even knew who he was. Her mother-in-law's accusations were so unfair, but even worse was the fact that now because of her, Michael would be left without an inheritance. Her mother-in-law stumped her with this threat. I have to disappear neatly somehow, she thought. This move, change my phone number. More than anything, Emily wanted to find her husband immediately and tell him everything. But when she saw him hurrying toward the gates of her mother's house, she instinctively hid around the corner. It was still possible to catch up with her husband, to call him. But for some reason, she was afraid that if because of her, Michael would be forever at odds with his mother. Emily felt her father's presence in her life and knew how dear parents were to their children. Meanwhile, Michael later knocked on his mom's room. "Come in, son," Jennifer exclaimed. He stepped into the whitewashed interior and squeezed his eyes shut out of habit. "Where's Emily?" "She left after previously calling me the last words I don't even want to repeat." "Called you names too," Michael said, confused. "Come on, she couldn't have." "That's ridiculous. Emily's not like that." "That's too bad, son." His mother smiled. "Why are you such a bad judge of character? Your Emily was yelling here that she really hopes I don't live long, and then she'll get all our money and property, and also kindly informed me that she'd been following me on the internet for a long time. And when she had the good fortune to meet you, she decided that now she was sure to get her way." "I don't believe you," shouted the son, pale with rage. "I don't. You have just made it all up." "How ungrateful you are," sighed the mother. "Should you be glad you're rid of that predator?" Michael did not finish listening to her. He ran out of the room, muttering something to himself. What was it? Jennifer couldn't make it out. And it didn't really matter. The important thing was that she'd won. She could be sure Emily would leave now that he was out of the inheritance. She settled back on the bed and smiled contentedly. At least she'd remembered something pleasant. A painful memory stirred. Jennifer pressed her lips tightly together. There was nothing to think about him. He'd traded her for some illegitimate girl he considered his blood. This scum who would squeeze money out of him was more important than the woman he loved. Tears still traitorously came to her eyes. What a shame it was to have that serene happiness end so soon. Emily waited for her husband to disappear into the house and looked around. Surely his conversation with his mother wouldn't last long, so he'd be heading back soon. Needing to get out of sight, she sighed and walked quickly across the street to a cozy coffee shop not far away. She could sit there and wait for the bus without having to stand in full view of everyone at the bus stop. Jason didn't pay any attention to the people who came in. He was too absorbed in his own thoughts to wake up until Emily asked softly, "No, excuse me, is this seat taken?" "No, it's free. Have a seat." The girl sat down and smiled. "I just have a good view of the bus stop from here. I don't want to miss my bus." He looked at her curiously. "That's strange. Do you remind me of someone?" "Yeah, who?" "My brother. He died recently." "No. Listen, what's your name?" Annie was a little embarrassed. Emily Christensen." "Does that mean anything to you?" Jason smiled happily, brightly. "You also lived in a neighboring town and grew up in an orphanage, didn't you? And your father. I only got letters from him. You know him. That's my brother. So I found you. I found you back home. Then they told me you were here. And I was wondering what to do. The city's so big, it's like a needle in a haystack. I've got everyone on my ass. Emily, did you find yourself?" "That's what the girl said. So you're my uncle. What's your name?" "Jason's my name. But listen, you have to tell me everything about yourself. What do you study? Where do you live? Is there anything you need?" "No, not at all." Annie answered hastily. "I live very well and I have nothing to complain about. I rent a room, I work in a good place, I'm a manicurist. I'm doing all right. Except I'm about to have to move out." No, wait," Jason interrupted her. "You don't have to rent. I have several apartments in this city, and you can move into any of them. Oh, and maybe you'd like to get a different profession. I can help you. I'd like to study to be a beautician, but I guess I should probably wait on that now." "Why?" "Because she hesitated. I'm pregnant." "You married?" Jason wondered. "I don't think I am," Emily answered sadly. "Okay," he stood up. "Let's go to my place right now. I have a big house, and you can stay with me. A pregnant woman shouldn't live alone." "Uncle Jason, I'm so uncomfortable. Stop it." She objected. He helped her up. "I'm your own uncle, and you say uncomfortable. And by the way, I've already figured out what room we're going to use for the nursery. Let's go." Jennifer hadn't been able to find a place for 6 months. Michael had cut off all contact with her, never answering his cell phone, never answering the door or even reading her messages. The housekeeper Jane, with whom he occasionally called, said that he was all worried about his wife, who seemed to have disappeared into thin air. No one knew where she'd gone, and Michael went out of his way to find her. She felt sorry for her son, but how could she explain to him that there was nothing to grieve for? Choose, instead of a cheap fortune hunter, a pretty girl from a good, and most importantly, wealthy family and marry her. If you want to become a father of a family so much, at least you can be calm and know that you marry not because of money. And Michael was desperate, especially since it was already approaching the date when the baby should be born. He made it a rule to call every day all of the maternity hospitals to find out if they have not received a woman in labor named Emily Christensen. I mean, if Emily didn't leave town, she had to give birth somewhere. And one day he was lucky. Emily nonchalantly clarified the voice in the tube. Just today, she is already discharged. What time? Michael shouted. What time is the discharge? Half an hour later, he was already standing at the door of the maternity hospital with a bouquet of flowers and a desperate hope that Emily would still allow him to at least look at the baby. Michael, he instantly recognized that sonorous voice. Jason Anderson greeting someone too. The man smiled. Remember, I told you. So I'm meeting her. The girl's got some kind of strange history with her husband. I still don't know who that scoundrel is. She refuses to talk about him. Oh well, whatever. But Sandy had twins. Great boys. I'm a great uncle now. At my old age. That's okay, Emily. Michael interrupted him. You said Emily. Yeah, my niece. Wait till you see this. By the way, who are you meeting? Wife, girlfriend. Jason kept talking, dragging Michael behind him like a tugboat. He wasn't really interested in the guy's answers. He was too preoccupied with his happiness. And Michael didn't answer anything. He suddenly realized who he was about to see, and he wasn't wrong. Emily, a little tired but so happy, came out to them, holding her son in her arms. The nurse solemnly handed the second one to Jason. Here you go, Grandpa. She smiled. Michael. She stopped, not knowing whether to be happy or sad. He stepped toward his wife. I finally found you, he said. Shoo. I finally found you, and I'll never lose you again. Jason, if he was surprised at what was happening, was careful not to let it show. He hummed a lullaby, rocking quietly with a baby in his arms. Jennifer Smith sat in her husband's office and stared in shock at the man in the strict business suit. He was spreading some documents, invoices, bills on the table, pointing to numbers she didn't understand. But she did understand one phrase, and now she wanted to live in despair. I'm afraid you're ruined, Jennifer Smith, she asked in a hoarse voice. How did this happen? You entrusted the administration of your late husband's affairs to a third party. You didn't handle them yourself. Is that correct? Jennifer, forgetting her makeup, rubbed her eyes with the palms of her hands. Yes. My husband hired a new trustee shortly before his death. I let him run the business. I don't know anything about business anyway. Well, the man shrugged his shoulders. You should understand. Of course, we will try to initiate criminal proceedings, but I must warn you, economic crimes are the most difficult to prove, all the more so when a professional has obviously worked here. Everything looks transparent, and you entrusted him with the management. He took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. So, there's no hope? She asked. We'll try to do something, but I can't promise you anything. I can only give you some advice, if I may. Investigations, trials, they don't all happen in a day. You have to understand that. It'll be easier for you if you try to sell your mansion, buy a modest apartment, then you'll have money left over. But you'll need a job too. Money runs out. Run out of money, Jennifer echoed. It's been 3 years. Well, Jennifer Smith, as of this year, you are now moving from assistant to full-time caregiver. Congratulations, announced the kindergarten director. Jennifer burst into tears. Working here with the children allowed her not to feel lonely for long periods of time and to feel alive. After all, in the modest one-bedroom where she now lived, only the television was her only companion. And now she was on her way to meet her first group of babies. Her assistant had already taken a few of the girls at the gate. As Jennifer looked around the prepared room for the group, "Hello," she heard 2 boyish voices behind her. Jennifer turned around and it felt like her heart skipped a beat. The twins looked like 2 drops of water like her son. "Hello, guys," she said, pulling herself together. Let's get acquainted. What are your names?" Sandy and Victor, the couple said in unison. Jennifer's whole day went like a dream. Annie looked forward to the evening with anticipation and fear at the same time. She had to shed many bitter tears and utter words of remorse. When Michael and Emily came to pick up the kids, at first they were adamant about transferring to another daycare center. But Michael was always kind, although he was not ready to forgive the mother, but noticing how she had changed gave her a chance. And 6 months later at the birthday party of the twins, Jennifer cried again, but with happiness. After all, now they were all together as a family sitting at home at a large festive table, and Jason was holding her hand. A millionaire woke up in a forest among ravenous wolves. But when he remembered about his wife, mother-in-law and inheritance ... MP4. It was starting to get light quickly when the car pulled onto a stretch of road that passed by a wide forest belt. The girl was very nervous. Streams of sweat were streaming down her face. In the thick fog, she saw the car they were following turn off to the side. "Stop here, please," asked the passenger. "Here, take this." She handed the money to the taxi driver and quickly ran towards the forest belt. It was early morning and the motorway was empty. She cautiously crept behind the first rows of trees until she reached the dirt road where the black Land Rover had turned off. She lurked behind a large bush. After about 20 minutes, the car pulled back onto the road and turned round, heading into town. The girl stopped, breathing out of fear. She came to her senses about 10 minutes later, and looking round, ran in the direction from which the Land Rover had come. The small forest was still asleep, and here and there she could hear birds singing. The girl heard a wolf howl and stopped. Her whole body trembled violently. Fear so gripped her that she could not move. She heard the crunch of a branch, and the girl ran forward. "Ben, where are you?" she shouted softly. "Ben." Tears ran down her cheeks. There was no answer, and the girl began to peer into the bushes. Suddenly she noticed how in one place the branches were pinned to the ground. On woozy legs she went there. The howling of the wolves intensified. "Ben." The girl shouted at the top of her voice. "Where are you? Please answer me." After about 5 minutes, she came to a small clearing. It was getting light, and the girl saw the clear outlines of trees. There was something lying near one of them. "Ben." The girl shrilled and rushed forward, but after a few meters her legs gave out and she fell. "I beg you, bear with me. I'm coming." She crawled forward. Her legs stopped obeying her, and she grabbed the branches of the bushes with all her might. The girl crawled to the wheelchair, near which a man was lying. He, with eyes that could not see the world, looked somewhere upwards. "Well, for such an event, we should have a drink," Andrew suggested, and quickly got 2 glasses and a bottle of wine from the cupboard. Yes, it was a complicated affair. Ben Wilson wiped his face with a handkerchief. He still couldn't believe they had managed to get such a good deal. "Ben, what did you want?" "We work honestly. We know how to negotiate." The deputy looked at the director. "So it's a well-deserved victory." Yeah, Ben sighed. "You know, Andrew, there's one thing I don't understand. Well, if they were ready to sign a contract with us from the very beginning, why all these tricks? To boost their self-esteem in their own eyes." Andrew sighed. "Our people can't work in a business-like manner. They want you to crawl on your knees and beg. It's all pointless, of course, but there's nothing you can do about it. That's the mentality of our people, but at least most of them." Ben Wilson had been in the medium-sized business for over 7 years. His factory produced a wide variety of garden tools. The assortment was not bad, so each year the scale of production increased. With small wholesalers, everything went well, but as soon as it came to large chain shops, so here negotiations were conducted for months and took a lot of effort. The richer people were, the more picky and capricious they were. And it was not easy to do business with them. So it happened with one big businessman who wore out all the nerves of Ben and his team, and still he eventually signed a contract with them. And to our professionalism. Andrew raised his glass. "Ben, stop worrying, everything's fine." "I'm sorry, I'm very tired," sighed the director. "I'm going to see the guys and I'll probably go home." "Come on. If there's anything urgent, I'll call you." Ben walked round the workshops and, satisfied that everything was going well, headed for his car. "Kate, are you home?" The man dialed his wife's number. "I'll be home early today." "Ben, Mom and I are going downtown. We want to walk around the city a bit," the wife replied. "I'll see you tonight." Ben looked at his watch. It was the beginning of 4. Mr. Ben Wilson sighed. He wished he could forget about everything now and spend the rest of the day with Kate. But she wasn't home again. The gate opened and the man drove into the yard. He saw several people rummaging in the garden. "Tom, hello," said the landlord, raising his hand in the air. "You're doing well." He headed towards his gardener. "Mr. Ben Wilson, good afternoon." Smiled broadly at the old man. "You are early today." "Yes, I want to rest," Ben replied. "Why haven't you gone yet?" He glanced at his watch. "Yes, Mrs. Caroline Smith didn't like the way I cut the lawn. She made me redo it." "Drop it," said the landlord and began to walk round the garden. "She's at it again. She's got everyone in a tizzy. Go home. I'll talk to her." The old man picked up his tools and headed towards the farmhouse. Ben watched him. Mrs. Smith had given him a hard time over the years. His mother-in-law had never been a friendly person. Everything had to be her way, and she wasn't interested in the rest. Ben made himself some flavored tea and went into his study. The servants had already dispersed. Only in the kitchen the cook and his assistant were still preparing dinner. "How I long to forget everything for a while," said the man aloud. "I've been so busy." He laid his head on the table, but a moment later there was a knock at his door. "Come in," he said loudly, and a cook with disheveled hair came in. "Mr. Ben, I forgot to ask you, what shall we do with the fish you brought?" the cook asked anxiously. "Mrs. Smith gave us quite a scandal this morning. She told us to throw it away." "Why?" The landlord couldn't understand. "It was fresh. I caught it yesterday." "I don't know," the man replied dryly. "She said the whole house smells of fish now." "Roast it for dinner tonight," Ben said. "I'll eat it with you with great gusto." "And Mrs. Smith?" "Let her eat what she wants. I don't care." It was about 7 o'clock in the evening. There was a noise downstairs, which was followed by Mrs. Caroline Smith shrieking. "I told you to throw that stinking fish away," she broadcast. "Now it stinks all over the house." "What's the matter?" Mr. Ben Wilson came down to the living room. "What's the matter?" "I asked Mr. Stone to cook fish for dinner." "Ben, you know I can't stand the smell of fish." Mrs. Smith turned up her nose. "I'm going to be sick." "Ben, what are you, like a little boy, really?" Kate looked at him unhappily. "I wonder if it's all right when Mrs. Smith orders fish in a restaurant," said the son-in-law unhappily. "Why, when I come back from fishing, she has only one thing on her mind: to throw my fish away as quickly as possible. But she does not sit in the restaurant kitchen, where they fry fish." "You don't care about my mum at all," Kate shouted. Ben said nothing. Inwardly, he was even glad that tonight he would spend his dinner with the cook and his assistant. "Mr. Stone, Sam, thank you from the bottom of my heart," the host licked his lips in pleasure. "The fish is delicious. Too bad it'll be cold tomorrow. But it's all right, I'll offer it to the boys for lunch. It will be delicious even in this form. Look at all the fried caviar left." The master talked to the men for a while and went up to his room. He looked into his wife Kate's room. "How are you?" he asked. "What have you been doing today?" He wanted to hug the woman, but she pulled away. "You don't like my mum?" She pouted. "What did she do to you? Do you always yell at her?" "Kate, what are you doing? What did I say to her?" The husband interrogated in amazement. But the woman remained cold, and Ben, after waiting a while, went to his room. "Is this family life?" he muttered to himself. "She has her own room, I have mine. Sometimes I think it would have been better if I hadn't married. It's been 5 years now, but there's still no change in my love life." The man lay down in bed and closed his eyes. He saw himself standing in the center of a large hall. The presentation was over and Mr. Ben Wilson and his manager were talking to an entrepreneur. He had 3 garden shops and wanted to take a small shipment from the businessman. Wilson and several other gardening suppliers were making a presentation to interested parties. "Yes, I'm happy with your terms," said the man. "Then my secretary and I will come to see you next week." It was Wednesday when a familiar man appeared in Mr. Ben Wilson's office, accompanied by a very glamorous young woman. "Kate will be assisting me," the entrepreneur introduced the stranger. During the discussion of the contract, Wilson looked at the girl every now and then. She seemed not to notice him. "Well, I proposed to celebrate our meeting with lunch in a cafe." Ben suggested that after the business was finished. The businessman agreed, and the company went to the nearest restaurant. After lunch, Wilson did not even want to say goodbye to his new acquaintance. Despite the hard work, the man from time to time had romantic relationships, but he never got married. Fortunately, a few days later, the entrepreneur sent Wilson his secretary with documents. Ben did not miss this opportunity. He wanted to get to know Kate better. "Can I invite you to lunch?" Wilson asked shyly. "Please do not refuse." But Kate refused. She cited the fact that she had to go back to work. "What about the weekend?" Ben looked her in the eye. "I promise we won't talk business. We'll have a friendly get-together." The girl wondered. What was in her head, Wilson did not know, but she, to his delight, agreed. "What do you do besides work?" Ben asked her when they met at the cafe. "I won't lie. Work takes up all my time," Kate sighed. "Unfortunately, I live with my mum, who is very ill. So I have to work hard to support myself," and her Kate said. "What about her?" Ben immediately asked. "Is it something serious?" "She's in hospital. She has a thyroid problem," Kate said. "She's living on pills, and they're expensive." "I'm sorry," Wilson sighed. "Kate, is there anything I can do to help you?" "Yes, what can you do?" she asked with annoyance in her voice. "If I could find a high-paying job, I would have given up my secretarial position a long time ago. Not only is it low-paying, but it takes up all my energy. You can have a quiet conversation. But there are those who immediately make a huge scandal." "I understand," Ben sighed. "We have such companions too. And there's no such thing as a perfect job. There are problems everywhere, but in some industries perhaps less than in others." Kate objected. "Yin?" After meeting with the girl, Wilson thought about it. He wanted to help her. The man decided to see if he could offer her something in his company, but it never came to that. After the first meeting, there was a second and another. And Ben didn't even notice how he fell in love with Kate. The man wondered what it was about her that drew him to her. Maybe it was her efficiency, or maybe he was attracted by the fact that the girl kept her distance. She didn't impose on Wilson, didn't hint at anything. And in general, it seemed that she did not care. But nevertheless, after 2 months of dating, Ben confessed his love to Kate. The girl was very embarrassed. She did not give an answer immediately, but asked Wilson to wait. For a fortnight, the man just went crazy. And when Kate called him and said yes, he felt the happiest in the world. "Ben, you have to meet my mum," the girl said afterwards. "I've already informed her that we're in a serious relationship." "I don't mind," he agreed. "Let me invite you to dinner at my place," said Ben. "I'll organize it. It'll be better than the most expensive restaurant." Mr. Wilson's parents lived far away. Many years ago, when Ben was still a student, he decided to stay in New York, and to his great surprise, he managed to establish himself there. Wilson was very nervous. He realized that his life probably depended on this meeting, but for some reason he did not like Mrs. Caroline Smith at first sight. The guest behaved in a way that made her seem arrogant, and Ben sensed it. "Ben, what a splendid house you have." Kate's mother looked round with delight. "Yes, you are to be envied. It's not like our one-room flat. If I could work, we could probably buy a house. But all my poor girl has to do is work to get by." Wilson pushed the unpleasant thoughts away and tried to do his best to please Mrs. Smith. She, in turn, showered him with compliments all evening and praised her daughter. "Ben, if a man as reliable as you had suggested marriage to Kate, I would have said yes at once," she said at dinner. The girl was silent most of the evening. It seemed to Wilson that she was thinking about something. "Kate, did something happen to you?" asked the host. "You look very worried." Yes, there was a problem at work. There's a paperwork issue, she said calmly. I'm sorry, I just want to forget about everything. But it's not working. Mrs. Smith, I can honestly tell you that my wife won't be working, Ben said. That's very commendable, the woman smiled. Only true loving husbands can respect their wives like that. Kate blushed. She looked at her mother and Wilson. Then she looked away and thought. After this meeting, Ben decided for himself that Kate would be his wife and he would finally marry. The wedding was a grand affair. On the bride's side, only her mother and a few friends were present. A month before the wedding, Kate quit her job and afterwards moved in with Ben. Naturally, her husband took her mother as well. For the first few months, Mr. Wilson flew with happiness. But then Mrs. Caroline Smith took over the household, and her disgruntled voice was constantly heard in the house. Ben tried to talk to her, but she immediately became unwell. And then Kate would give her husband a scandal. Ben, you know she has a thyroid problem, she scolded. She has an unstable emotional state, so she sometimes breaks down. But after all, she doesn't scream like a madwoman. She's just making remarks to the servants. And for 3 years, Wilson let it all happen. But then he caught Smith red-handed, so to speak, a few times. Once his mother-in-law had sacked the maid for some reason only she knew. Ben sighed, but didn't interfere. 3 days later, he was still in his study when voices were heard downstairs. Mrs. Smith was saying something unpleasant to a stranger who looked to be about 27 or 30 years old. Well, if you're not ready to stay after work and correct your mistakes, Wilson heard, then you're not suitable for us. And why should I clean badly? Replied the girl timidly. I know my job. I have experience. Because for the kind of salary I'm offering, everything should be perfect. Mrs. Smith said angrily. The hostess showed her hand for the guest to leave the house. The girl looked through her bag and her hands for a few seconds, and without answering, went to the front door. Wait, she heard a man's voice. You have been hired, Ben said loudly, and looked intently into his mother-in-law's eyes. I'm the boss. Mrs. Smith wanted to contradict him, but she was afraid to. Her face was flushed because her insides were boiling. There will be no overwork, Wilson added. Even if you make mistakes, that's okay. I'll never make you work late here, said Mr. Ben Wilson. Can't you see that this person is not suitable for us? Said the mother-in-law at last. I'm better at housekeeping than you are. What's your name? Ignoring her mother-in-law's words, the host turned to the guest. Samantha, she answered timidly. I have references. I worked as a maid for 3 years. If you are ready, then start work today, please, Ben said calmly, and left the house. Mrs. Caroline Smith whispered curses to herself. Then she looked at Samantha with such hatred that she flinched. Samantha, the cook, called to the new girl, the master is a good man, but his mother-in-law is a real fool. But if Ben personally took you in, you don't have to be afraid of her. The girl tried her best to clean the house in such a way that there would be no complaints against her. But Mrs. Smith found something to complain about. You haven't cleaned the drawing room properly, she said, pointing her finger. What was that? Samantha stared at her in bewilderment. She couldn't understand what the landlady wanted from her. Ben's mother-in-law had followed the girl around that day. She made sure the new maid was so winded that she wouldn't show up for work the next day. But the next day, Samantha was already doing her chores first thing in the morning, as she was supposed to do. Mrs. Smith looked at her angrily. And if she hadn't been warned by her master this morning, she would probably have quit her job on the second day. Samantha, I don't care what Mrs. Smith wants, Ben said before leaving. You were hired by me. That's why you're my responsibility. At lunchtime, the landlady deliberately spilled coffee on the carpet and threw a big tantrum. You did it, the cleaner replied calmly. That stain wasn't here 5 minutes ago. How dare you accuse me? Mrs. Smith shouted at the house. You're nobody here. Mrs. Smith shouted. Samantha said nothing. She defiantly began to scrub the stain. The woman shouted something else at her for a long time. Almost 2 years had passed, but Mrs. Smith had never been able to fire anyone since. If anyone ever left Mr. Wilson's house, it was of their own accord. Ben shuddered and opened his eyes. He felt a little ashamed of his inner discontent. He had everything the average man could only dream of. Oh, and Kate appeared to be very calm. She seldom quarreled with her husband. Ben often took her to various meetings and many times listened to flattering compliments about her. "Mr. Wilson, your wife is divine," a partner once told him. "You could move mountains for a woman like that." But Ben didn't have to do that. Kate never gave him reason to doubt herself. All their fights were about her mother, but Ben had stopped paying attention to that in time. The only thing that weighed on him was the fact that they had no children. Kate was almost 30, and Wilson was starting to worry about that. Ben, but we're trying, his wife once told him. You shouldn't be panicking. It's just not the right time yet. After the wedding, Ben immediately forbade his wife to work. She had a lot of arguments with him about it at first. "Ben, but I cannot sit in four walls," Kate said. "Well, if you don't want me to work, then let me do some volunteer work." "What are you going to do?" my husband wondered. "Delivering food to poor people's homes." "But you can do a lot of things now," she objected. "You can organize holidays for sick children, buy them presents and clothes. I can take a few families into my care and help them." "Well, if that's what you want to do, that's fine," Ben agreed. "Just tell me how much money you'll need a month." "Yes, I've already calculated it," she said. Mr. Wilson perked up. He looked at Kate in bewilderment. "What did you think?" She understood his surprise. "They won't give me anything for free in the shop." "All right," the man sighed. "So be it, if it makes you happy. I'll do it." Kate happily threw herself on his neck. So the girl organized a small charity fund, and since she worked all the time, she was hardly ever home during the day. "Kate, will you get there soon with your volunteering?" Mrs. Smith said at dinner one night. "Ben, at least tell her." "Mum, come on," her daughter objected. "I like my job very much, and you're the boss of the house. I don't meddle in your affairs." "Really, Mrs. Smith, if it gives Kate pleasure to help others, let her do it," said the son-in-law. "I don't put much money into it." As time went on, another problem arose. Kate had become so tired from her work that she had converted one of the guest rooms into her bedroom. Ben didn't like that very much. But were husband and wife, Ben resisted. "It's not like I'm going to come to your place at night." "Ben, don't worry, I'll fulfill my duties," laughed the wife. "I'm sorry, I'm so tired that at the end of the day I don't want to see anyone. You work with people yourself, so you must understand." "Yes, I understand," sighed Wilson. "How are we going to have children?" "We'll find time for that," Kate kissed her husband. For example, now Ben closed the door and threw himself on the bed. He began to embrace his wife with passion. At last he fell asleep. His sleep was restless. The man kept tossing and turning and opening his eyes. "When will I finally get some sleep?" Ben grumbled unhappily when he got up in the morning. It was one of the few days they had breakfast as a family. Kate was usually still asleep when her husband left for work. "So, why don't we go away this weekend?" he suggested. "It's been a while since we've been out." "Come on," Kate seconded him. "I suggest we go go-karting. I've been a few times and I really enjoyed it." "You want to go go-karting?" My husband was surprised. "Well, I don't mind. Mrs. Smith, are you coming with us?" "God forbid." The mother-in-law waved her hands in the opposite direction. "Don't even think of trying to persuade me." "All right, then, we'll go together, we'll race you," laughed Kate. Mr. Wilson was eagerly waiting for them to go karting. Kate asked her husband if he could buy the whole track for an hour so they wouldn't be disturbed. Ben happily agreed. It was warm September weather, and the couple were driving out of town in anticipation. Both were rubbing their hands together. Kate was smiling at the thought. "And what will happen to me if I overtake you?" Ben's eyes sparkled. "I'll do whatever you want," Kate replied flirtatiously. "All right. You try to outrun me. I'm sure you can't." Mr. Wilson excitedly pulled into the car park, which was empty. A few minutes later, a stout young man came out to them. He immediately gave their surname and led the way to two go-karts. "This is for you, Mr. Wilson. He pointed to the racing car with his hand. "And this pink one is for your wife." "I'll show you, shall I?" Ben jumped in his go-kart. "I'm going to beat you to the punch." The cars started at the same time and Kate was in the lead. Ben gave her a bit of a head start. The woman took her time. She didn't want to squeeze out all the speed. For a few laps they did. But then Ben started to pick up speed and got in line with his wife. At one corner he overtook her. Kate tried to catch up with him. Then Mr. Wilson maxed out and went full speed ahead. Ben didn't realize what had happened. He only felt that the car was no longer obeying him. A moment later he felt a somersault. Then another cart slammed into the car and pushed him forward. Everything was spinning before Mr. Wilson's eyes. He wanted to get out of the car, but he couldn't. Some voices were heard. The man opened his eyes. Everything was blurred. He lost consciousness. An hour and a half later, an ambulance finally arrived and Ben was rolled into the car on a stretcher. His wife was fussing with the doctors. She was crying, asking them something. "Is he going to live?" Mr. Wilson said. He couldn't open his eyes. His body seemed lifeless. "I don't know yet," replied the doctor. "We're doing everything we can," he said dryly. And Ben was taken to the intensive care unit. He didn't remember much of what happened next. He was coming round and then he lost consciousness again. He heard voices beside him. He overcorrected and lost control. Kate's voice came to him. "Jesus, what are these maps for?" Somebody was indignant. "Why don't they ban them? There's enough trouble in life to go around. And here someone needs adrenaline." 3 days later, Mr. Wilson finally came to his senses. There was no one around him. He moved his lips, called out for someone. A woman in a white coat came over. "What happened to me?" he asked the doctor with difficulty. "My wife and I went go-karting." "Unfortunately, we crashed," the doctor replied. "It's very rare, but you were lucky. You could have been killed." "When I get out of here, I want to get up," Ben asked. "I feel like I can't feel my legs." "Unfortunately, your spine is badly damaged," sighed the doctor. "It's unlikely you'll be able to walk." Ben said nothing. He only looked at the doctor pleadingly. Tears ran down his cheeks. In the evening, Kate arrived. She was already aware of it. The woman was crying all the time. "I'm sorry, Ben," she sobbed. "It's all my fault. Why did I suggest we go there? I've ruined you." "Kate, it wasn't your fault," her husband reassured her. "I was the one who stepped on the gas." "It's all my fault." But the woman's behavior was impeccable. She seemed to be going crazy. It made Ben uncomfortable. He didn't want to see anyone. And then there was Kate's tantrums. "You should be thankful you're still alive," a doctor once told a patient. None of us could make any guarantees in the beginning. Ben gathered all his will into a fist and ordered himself to move on. Already in the hospital, he went back to his work. His deputy, Andrew, came to see him and they discussed all working points as far as possible. After 2 months, Mr. Wilson was discharged from the hospital and he began a completely different life. The man had no intention of quitting his job. He hired a muscular driver to take him to the factory. Working in a wheelchair was very difficult. Ben did his best. There were special up and downs for him so that he could get around in his wheelchair on his own. There was always an assistant in the office to help the man with his household chores. Ben did not want to be pitied. He was in great pain from sympathetic looks. "I'm a director. I'm not a defenseless creature. I can handle it," he once told Andrew. "I'll never give up my job." At Mr. Wilson's house, too, there were changes. On the one hand, Kate sympathized with her husband. On the other hand, she somehow began to distance herself from him. "Ben, I've closed my fund," his wife once told him. "Let's try to go abroad for rehabilitation." "Kate, that won't save me," the husband replied. "I'll never get back on my feet. We just have to learn to live with it." Mrs. Smith became increasingly silent in her son-in-law's presence. It was as if neither wife nor mother-in-law knew what to do next. Samantha, the landlord, said to the cleaning lady, "I want to ask you to help me during the day. I can't go to work every day now. And I need a reliable person at home." You've been with us for years, and I trust you completely. I'll find someone else to clean." "All right, Mr. Wilson," she smiled. "You just tell me what I need to do. Soon the house will be fully equipped for my wheelchair, and then I'll need a chaperone and an assistant. The duties are exactly the same as in any care for an invalid," Mr. Wilson replied. "I'm sorry, but I can't ask anyone else for this job. I have almost all my laborers of age." The girl agreed and immediately began her new duties. "Samantha, why haven't you vacuumed the living room yet?" Mrs. Caroline Smith was indignant when the maid came down from the first floor. "I'm sorry, but Mr. Wilson has taken me on as his assistant," Samantha replied calmly. "I don't work as a cleaner anymore," she added, blushing. "How much trouble he got on my nerves with you." The landlady swore. "I would have sacked you a long time ago," she whispered like a snake. Samantha said nothing and went into the kitchen. She had to get her master some tea. Mr. Wilson's mother-in-law stared at her unhappily. She was thinking hard about something. A few months after the accident, Mr. Wilson began to notice that his wife had grown cold to him. Kate had closed her foundation, but she still sponsored a few families. So in the evenings, the woman did her job. "Kate, you and I haven't spoken for a long time." Her husband met her one evening. "Did something happen to you?" "Ben, I still can't forgive myself," she cried. "When I look at you, I don't want to live." "Kate, you should be glad I'm alive," smiled Mr. Wilson. "But come to me. I've missed you so much." He took her hand and went to his room. The woman kissed her husband without much enthusiasm. Mr. Wilson could feel it, and it made him feel even more hurt. He told himself that day that he would not insist on their intimacy again. But in his heart, he wished that Kate's love had not only not faded because he had become an invalid, but that it had flared up with renewed vigor. Mr. Wilson himself did not understand where he got such moral strength from. Instead of being sad, he would smile when he had a strong urge inside him to drop everything and end his life. He would embark on some new endeavor. Old, unreliable partners were replaced by new ones who respected Ben for his fortitude and optimism. "Samantha, why don't we go to a museum?" Mr. Wilson once suggested to his nurse. "You'll laugh, but I want to go to the Paleontological Museum." "All right," smiled the nurse. "To be honest, I've never been there." She looked a little embarrassed. "Then we should definitely go there," the owner smiled. "I'm sure you'll like it there." It was Saturday when the driver took Mr. Wilson and his assistant to the museum, even though it was a day off. There weren't many people there. Mostly everyone was trying to get into the dinosaur room. "What do you think?" Laughed when he saw Samantha's surprised face. "Look at that giant." "Honestly, I'm really glad we weren't there at the time," the girl said with pale lips. "If I'd seen him in person, I'd have lost my mind." "Well, they weren't all carnivores," replied Mr. Wilson. "Many of them were herbivores. It's understandable that we could get into their stomachs, like the little bugs we don't see on the leaves of vegetables. I don't think they would have fed on us. There were giant forests. They had plenty to eat." Samantha and Mr. Wilson were looking at the most interesting exhibits. "What a good holiday we had," the owner said as they drove home. "It sounds ridiculous, but it was only when I got into a wheelchair that I really began to appreciate life, every moment of it. Now I'm not so afraid of losing anything." Samantha smiled. She thought about the fact that she had nothing. A rented flat, a salary, half of which she sent to her parents. The girl lived on the other. In essence, she had nothing to lose either. Mr. Wilson arrived home in high spirits. He was anxious to discuss his trip with his wife. Kate was already home. "Kate," he rode up to his wife. "I'd like to take you out for a romantic dinner." Mr. Wilson was a little worried. His wife looked at him in amazement. She remained silent and waited to see what her husband would tell her. "I am inviting you to the hotel tomorrow. I want to organize a romantic evening for us," he said with hope in his voice. "It will not oblige us to anything, but I wanted us to spend it outside our house." "All right," Kate smiled. "Then let it be our date. I'll come to the hotel, and you'll be waiting for me with flowers." The man took his wife's hand. "I love you. I promise you won't regret it." Mr. Wilson stayed up most of the night. There was a great excitement inside him. He had waited so long for Kate to finally accept what had happened and just love him. "I'm going to order a huge bouquet of red roses," he planned. "We'll have champagne and fruit brought to our room. I want that so badly." Towards morning, the man fell asleep. He dreamt of Kate holding roses. Mr. Wilson woke up around 11 o'clock. Samantha had already knocked on his door several times, but since he didn't answer, she didn't come in. Finally, he pressed the bell and a carer came into his room. "Did something happen to you?" she asked. "Can I help you?" "Yes," the owner answered immediately. "Samantha, please order a huge bouquet of red roses and prepare my outfit for me." "Are we going out tonight?" She smiled. "Do you have an appointment?" "I'm having a romantic dinner with my wife tonight," Mr. Wilson said cheerfully. "Samantha, can I ask you one more thing? I let Max go today. You could take a taxi with me to the hotel and I'll come from there," said Mr. Wilson. "Would that be all right?" "Of course I'll go with you," Samantha agreed. "Don't worry, I'll take care of everything." Mr. Wilson was very nervous and couldn't sit still. It was 6 o'clock in the evening when he and Samantha got into the taxi. The man really wanted to show that he was independent. He arranged with Kate that he would go to the hotel early and wait for her there. Kate intended to be there by 8 o'clock. The nurse helped Mr. Wilson into his room, put flowers in a vase, and it was 8:30. Samantha said goodbye to her host. "See you tomorrow, Mr. Wilson," she said goodbye and left the room. The girl stopped outside the large, beautiful hotel building and looked up. Somewhere up there was her host. There was a small cafe just opposite the hotel, and Samantha decided to have a cup of tea. The girl closed her eyes with pleasure. She ate her favorite cakes with real buttercream. Suddenly, her gaze fell on the opposite side. The girl saw Kate's car. Kate and some other person got out of it. The lanterns of the hotel complex illuminated a tall, handsome man. Mr. Wilson's wife spoke to him for a moment, then she kissed the stranger. Samantha shuddered, nestling against the window. Some other car pulled up and the man apparently got into it. Kate waved at someone and headed for the hotel. Who was that? The carer's heart pounded frantically. Judging by the way he was kissing her, clearly not a friend. Samantha didn't know what to do. She began to worry about Mr. Wilson. The landlord was a kind man who never hurt anyone. And the girl felt that she could not leave him. She had a clear feeling that trouble was going to happen. The cafe was an all-night cafe, and Samantha drank about 10 mugs of tea all night. She could barely hold herself up. She wanted to sleep madly, but the feeling of danger never left her inside. It was 5 o'clock in the morning. Then the girl saw Kate, who ran out of the hotel, got into her car, and drove away. Where was Ben? Samantha couldn't understand. She started to gather her things when the front door of the hotel opened and the security guard helped Mr. Wilson into the street. Samantha breathed a sigh of relief. She dressed as she walked, and before she had reached the exit a few meters away, she saw, as if in slow motion, that a car pulled up sharply in front of the hotel and 2 men ran out of it. They quickly shoved Ben into the car and drove off. "Stop!" The nurse ran after the car, but she was too far away and it was dark outside. "What am I going to do?" Samantha burst into tears. Just then a taxi pulled up outside the hotel. The girl immediately ran up to it. "I beg you, please go," she begged. "I'll pay you double the fare." The taxi driver was reluctant at first, but then he heard the amount the stranger said, and he couldn't resist. "We need to find a black Jeep," the passenger ordered. "Let's head towards the motorway. I'm sure they left the city." The girl's intuition did not fail, and very quickly a familiar car appeared ahead. Samantha asked the taxi driver to keep to the side. They drove for about an hour. The forest appeared ahead. "It's getting light," she said. The Jeep turned somewhere to the side. "Yes, there's a forest there," the taxi driver replied to her request to turn behind the Jeep. "There's no road there, only a dirt track." Samantha didn't know whether she was more afraid of the darkness and wolves or of seeing her master dead. God, who were those people? What have they done to him? She thought. Cautiously, she advanced through the bushes. The girl's legs trembled. She could clearly hear the wolf howl, but somehow inside her she was sure that Ben was alive. So no matter how frightened she was, she went forward. "God help me," Samantha whispered. "I beg you, help me find him." The girl's vision had already become accustomed to the grayness and the slight fog. She could clearly distinguish that the bushes were mussed to one side, and it was obvious that someone had passed there. Samantha walked about 30 meters. Somewhere close to her, she heard a wolf howl. The girl fell to the ground in fear. Her legs no longer obeyed, and she crawled. "Ben," she shouted as loudly as she could. "Ben, where are you?" But there was silence. Even the wolves were silent. A gap appeared ahead, and under a large tree the girl spotted a bulky object. She crawled towards it. Again she heard the wolf howl. "Ben," Samantha shouted as she crawled over to the wheelchair. She saw her master. He was breathing very quietly. The girl tapped his cheeks. He opened his eyes but immediately lost consciousness. "No, Ben," screamed the girl. Then she instinctively pulled out her phone. First, Samantha wanted to call the police and an ambulance. Plus, I needed to inform his wife, because they must have wanted to kill him, the nurse whispered. "I need to call a taxi and take him to the hospital." Samantha tried to get to her feet. After a while, she managed it. She took off her cloak, put Ben on it, and dragged him towards the motorway. The girl had already hailed a taxi. The driver helped load the owner into the car and drove the passengers to the nearest hospital. "I'll pay you. Book him without papers." The girl handed the doctor the money. He immediately examined the victim. The owner didn't look well. He showed no signs of violence, but his weak heartbeat suggested that he had been injected with some kind of drug. Whether Ben's body was so strong that his heart did not stop, or whether it was a miracle Mr. Wilson survived. 3 days later, he regained consciousness. Samantha had to proceed very carefully. The day she found Ben, she drove to his house for work. She was met on the doorstep by Mrs. Caroline Smith and told that Samantha would be taking a week's break. According to her, the landlord was away for a while. "Good," replied the nurse calmly. The girl tried to pick up anything suspicious about Ben's wife, but apart from the fact that she looked preoccupied, she saw nothing else. Could it be that all these events were not connected at all? Samantha pondered. Mrs. Caroline Smith doesn't know that her daughter has someone on the side. Perhaps they've already discovered Mr. Wilson is missing. But as he is a man of means, they investigate without strangers or fuss. Who were those people competitors? Who could he have failed to please? For the 3 days that Mr. Wilson didn't regain consciousness, Samantha simply went mad. None of the man's relatives had called her either, and that seemed very strange. If the police were investigating the case, she would be one of the witnesses. At least she would definitely be questioned, since she had spent so much time with him the day Mrs. Smith had sent Samantha on holiday. The girl called Mr. Wilson's cook. "I don't know," she heard. "I haven't seen him either. They say he's away on some urgent business. He's got a big contract coming up. But why he didn't take you, or at least warn you, I have no idea." We're as quiet as ever. "They say the old landlady was very ill yesterday morning. She nearly died here. They even called an ambulance." Samantha hung up the phone and realized that she would just have to wait for Mr. Wilson to come round and start talking properly. Then maybe something would become clearer. The girl spent almost the entire day by her master's side. Mr. Wilson was surprised when he came to his senses. "What are you doing here?" "Where am I?" He looked around. "In the hospital." "Yes, Mr. Wilson, what happened to you?" She looked him in the eye. "Do you remember being kidnapped?" Mr. Wilson looked at her in bewilderment. It was as if he was trying to rewind time. He finally succeeded, and the man shuddered. "Samantha, I pulled out of the hotel and waited for a taxi, but someone pulled me into the car. I felt a prick. Everything else happened like a dream." Mr. Wilson's face was covered in sweat. "Did you see these people?" The nurse said quietly. "Do you know them?" She tried not to draw attention to herself. "No," replied the master thoughtfully. "I think they were trying to kill me." He turned pale. "I found you in a wooded area not far from the forest," the girl began to reason. "There were wolves there. Perhaps the calculation was that in a few days they would have killed you, so no one would ever know how you got there. Samantha, how did you find me? Mr. Ben Wilson asked in amazement. He was only now beginning to realize the meaning of her words. I'm sorry, but I followed you. She lowered her head. When I left the hotel, I decided to have tea in the cafe opposite. I was very tired that day, but when I saw that your wife had arrived, and not alone, I was afraid for you. Not alone. What do you mean? The master looked intently into the girl's eyes. I won't lie. There was a man with her. I didn't see his face, Samantha replied, but I can tell you that they were kissing. Then a car pulled up and the man got into it. Samantha, are you sure? Mr. Wilson said in horror. Maybe you imagined the whole thing. You see, the man lowered his eyes ashamedly. My wife and I had a wonderful romantic evening. We were going to go home in the morning, but at 4 o'clock my mother-in-law rang to say she was dying. She'd had a seizure. Mrs. Smith left me and went straight home. I had to call a taxi and come back myself. You know the rest of it. I've been to your house, the nurse sighed. Mrs. Smith was actually very ill. An ambulance was called. But what do they say about me? Mr. Wilson became agitated. Have they got the police looking for me? I don't think so, Samantha replied. I was put on a week's leave, saying you'd gone somewhere else. I don't understand, Mr. Wilson said with frustration in his voice. What am I supposed to do now? Go home and file a report. I think the girl took his hand. Mr. Wilson, it's not safe for you to go home now. What about my factory? The man asked in shock. Samantha, I can't leave my job. You need to talk to a trustworthy person. Let it go on, as it has suggested the nurse. It'll be everyone's version of the story that you're away for a fortnight, but you have to keep it a secret. Otherwise they'll find you, and this time they won't let you live. God, I don't know why. Mr. Ben Wilson said quietly. I never did anything to anybody. Why would they want to kill me? I was to be eaten by wolves. That's nonsense. Mr. Wilson, did you know that Kate was seeing someone? Samantha asked me out of the blue. Samantha, I'm sorry, but I still think you imagined it. The owner looked at her intently. Just because she had a man in her car doesn't mean anything. Kate works with people. But the fact that she kissed him, I'm sure that's just your imagination. The girl looked at him in bewilderment and said nothing to him. Samantha realized that unless she had any proof, she would not be able to convince her master of anything. Mr. Wilson, you must not go home, she ordered sternly. You will be discharged in a few days, and you must hide. But where? Thought the landlord. I'll get myself a place to live for a couple of months. Will you help me with that? Yes, Samantha agreed. Especially since you said they didn't take any documents from you. Take the card in my wallet. I'll give you the code. Take care of the flat, please. Samantha, can you stay with me for a while? I'll pay for everything. Don't worry. I won't leave you, the nurse smiled. I'll be leaving now. Take my old phone. It's not safe for you to use yours. What if there's some kind of bug in there? If you have any problems, call me straight away. My number's on there. Mr. Wilson looked at her in surprise. Despite everything he'd been through, he still couldn't believe this wasn't a joke. He was actually going to be killed. Samantha left and Mr. Wilson was completely absorbed in his thoughts. He began to check all his partners in his mind to see which one of them could have done this. But from the outward signs he could observe, none of them cared about him. He then turned his gaze to his subordinates. Could Andrew have done such a thing? A thought came into his head. I've worked with him for so many years, he's a reliable man. I certainly can't pry into his soul. Even if I imagine he did it, what was his motivation? To take the factory away from me? How? Mr. Ben Wilson clutched his head tiredly. Everything was spinning before his eyes, but he needed to continue his research. All right, he sighed. Now let's look at Kate and her mother, Mrs. Caroline Smith. Both lived without much trouble. They spent money left and right. What did they lack? They had everything. Does Kate have a lover? Well, after the night I spent with her at the hotel, I doubt it. Maybe Samantha saw someone she knew kiss her on the cheek, especially since it was already dark. And I miss her a lot. It was the most passionate night of our married life. I finally realized how much Kate loves me. I mean, she's worried about me right now. How do I let her know? Samantha immediately removed the SIM card from my phone. I'm sure my wife must have called me many times. Mr. Wilson had very conflicted feelings. He clearly felt that after what had happened between him and his wife, there was no longer any doubt about Kate's love. But nevertheless, he was to be killed, and it was necessary to proceed with extreme caution. He picked up the phone Samantha had left him. At first he wanted to call, but changed his mind. "Sweetheart, I'm fine, don't worry." He wrote a message. A minute later his phone rang. Mr. Wilson was afraid to pick up the phone. Kate had called many times, but he held back. Then came the message, "Ben, where are you? I'm freaking out." "I already want to go to the police," the wife wrote. "You don't need to say anything to the police. When everything is fine, I'll find you myself," the husband replied in a text message. Kate made another attempt to call Mr. Wilson, but he never picked up the phone. Samantha quickly found a suitable accommodation, paid the landlady, and took the keys and went straight to the hospital. "Hi," she dialed on the way. "Well, what's up? Do you have any news? I've been out of work for a few days." "Samantha, yes, we have a lull," answered the cook. "The owners are a bit jumpy though, but other than that, everything's fine. Mr. Ben Wilson hasn't arrived yet, and will not come." The girl switched off her phone. "Because it's not safe for him to show his face right now," she muttered to herself. Samantha entered Mr. Wilson's room. He was asleep. She went to see his doctor. "We'll discharge him in 2 days," the doctor replied. "He needs good care. I think you realize he won't get up." The nurse herself knew that there was no chance of Mr. Wilson's recovery. That's what the best doctors had told him that time. The girl looked into the room again. The landlord was awake. "Samantha, I think the only person who could have done it was Andrew, my deputy," Mr. Wilson whispered. "I still don't understand what he was trying to achieve, though." "Mr. Ben, let's not jump to conclusions," Samantha replied dryly. "Tomorrow night I'll pick you up and we'll go to the new flat. We'll need to buy you some clothes. I'll pick up the new pram tomorrow." "I've already made arrangements for that, Ben." "Thank you," said Mr. Wilson, tears welling up in his eyes. "It's not the first time you've saved me." "It's going to be all right." She stroked the man's head. "The main thing is that nobody knows where you are now. I think something will turn up soon." "Shouldn't we report it to the police?" the owner asked her. "Would they at least be able to protect me?" "I wouldn't get my hopes up," she said coldly. "Anyone can be bribed nowadays. Nobody gives any guarantee." Jesus. "What I can't understand is, who could I have interfered with?" Mr. Wilson sighed. "I didn't set anyone up. I didn't cheat. I didn't have affairs with other people's wives. Why would anyone be mad at me?" "It's hard to say. It could be purely psychological," the girl replied. "Someone just doesn't like you." Disgust. "Can it really be like that?" Mr. Wilson looked at her in bewilderment. "But if you killed everyone just because you didn't like someone, then half of humanity would have gone to the other side of the world by now." Late that night, Samantha drove home. She was still inclined to believe that Kate or her mother was involved in the whole affair. That's what her gut told her. But Samantha had no direct evidence, so she couldn't accuse them in front of Mr. Ben Wilson. The girl was about to enter her driveway, as something urged her to call a taxi and drive to Mr. Wilson's house. From the side, she watched the owner's 2-story house. It was almost 12 noon, but there was a light on in one of the rooms. What was going on in there? The girl stared out the familiar window. It was Mr. Wilson's study. It was almost 2 when the lights went out and apparently everyone had gone to bed. "What's the meaning of all this?" thought the nurse. "I wish I could stay here until morning and see to it all. But I can't. I have to pick up Mr. Wilson today. I just don't have the energy for it all." The girl hailed a taxi and walked towards the crossroads. It was dark, it was cold, it was starting to snow. It was the middle of March. Samantha went into her flat and fell on the bed, but she didn't have long to sleep. At 8 o'clock, the alarm clock rang. The girl opened her eyes, started to get ready. She immediately hailed a taxi and headed for Mr. Wilson's house. But all was quiet there. Perhaps everyone was still asleep. At 10 o'clock, the girl was already at Mr. Wilson's. He was up early today. He wanted to leave the hospital as soon as possible. The man planned to call someone from the factory and discuss what was happening there in secret. But while he was in a public place, the owner was afraid to call anyone. The nurse brought the wheelchair in the afternoon and Mr. Wilson went to his new accommodation. This is where we're going to live now. The girl brought the landlord back in his wheelchair. It's not a bad flat. There are even handles in some places, she said, so you'll be able to move around easily. Just don't speed up too much, Samantha laughed. I've speeded up once in my life, and now I'm in a wheelchair, sighed Mr. Ben Wilson. Samantha, thank you. I don't know how I can ever thank you enough. When this is over, you'll invite me to the museum, she laughed again. I really enjoyed going to these places with you. I promise, the owner smiled broadly. You and I will visit the most interesting museums. The nurse quickly organized dinner. She and her host ate a delicious meal and Samantha helped Mr. Wilson to lie down on his bed. The girl made herself comfortable on the sofa in the kitchen. Tonight I'll finally get some sleep and tomorrow we'll decide what we'll do next, were her last thoughts. And she fell into sleep. The next day at 8 o'clock, Mr. Wilson woke Samantha up. The girl was so sound asleep that she did not even hear him. Finally, she opened her eyes and jumped up. Mr. Wilson, I'm sorry, but I've been so busy the last few days that I slept like a dead person, she tried to justify herself. They made breakfast together and ate quickly. Mr. Wilson thought long and hard that night and decided to send Samantha to his factory. Samantha, could you meet one person? Mr. Wilson asked her. I trust him. After you explain everything to him, I can call him and find out something about Andrew. The girl left her host and went to his enterprise. Samantha had been to the gatehouse there several times. The girl gave the first and last name of the person she wanted to meet. Half an hour later, an elderly gray-haired man appeared at the gatehouse. Mr. Brown, I need to talk to you in private, Samantha said quietly. I'm from Mr. Ben Wilson, said Samantha. The man looked at her perplexed. He followed the girl outside. You see, it turned out that Mr. Wilson was going to be killed, and thank God it didn't work out. Mr. Wilson can't go out in public right now. It's dangerous for him. We're trying to find out who planned to commit this crime. Can you please tell me what's going on at your factory? Nothing much, replied the man in astonishment. Everything is quiet at the factory. A few days ago, the owner's wife called him and told him that he would be gone for a fortnight. He had flown abroad for rehabilitation. Work is going on as usual. Tell me, is your deputy a reliable man? Samantha asked him cautiously. Andrew? The man was surprised. I've been working for Mr. Wilson for years. I've never had any problems with him. He's a good man. Samantha thought for a moment. She felt she had nothing more to ask Mr. Brown. The girl asked him to keep their conversation private for the time being. I don't think his deputy is involved in all this, the nurse thought on the way home. It's a very complicated story, and we can't do without the police. Mr. Wilson was alone. His head was boiling. After the assassination attempt, he was afraid of everything. On the one hand, the man wanted to go to the police. On the other, he planned to bide his time a little longer. Mr. Wilson took Samantha's phone in his hands, twisted it around for a long time. Finally, he couldn't stand it any longer and called his wife. My darling, I want you to know that I'm all right. I've missed you so much. Ben, where are you? I heard a worried voice. Please tell me. I want to come to you. What's going on? What's wrong with you? You see, someone wanted to kill me, said Mr. Wilson. Kill you how? Kate's voice trembled. A man called us a few days ago on your behalf and said you were away for a week or two, that you'd call us yourself afterwards. Why did I leave you that night? I should have waited for you and we could have gone home together. I'm begging you, tell me where you are. I promise no one will ever know. I'll only be with you for a few minutes. Ben, I can't take it. Do you realize that? I'll just die. The husband felt so much pain that he couldn't stand it and told Kate his address. Samantha, he called the carer. "Could you follow my deputy for a couple of hours?" Mr. Wilson asked her. He named the make of his car. Ben still thought it was Andrew who had organized all this. Samantha waited outside the factory for 5 hours. She was already freezing, but Andrew never traveled outside of work. "I think someone else did it," Samantha thought. None of his employees could have done it. She walked tiredly to the bus stop and dialed Ben's number, but he didn't answer. Samantha thought he was asleep. After about 10 minutes, she called him again. Maybe he's not feeling well, she worried, and instinctively hailed a taxi. She needed to get home faster. Ben waited impatiently for Kate to arrive. He didn't want Samantha to know about it, so he asked his carer to follow Andrew. All these days, Mr. Wilson didn't miss Kate very much. He couldn't get their last night out of his head. It seemed to the man that he had fallen even more in love with his wife after that, so his whole body was shaking with the upcoming meeting. Ben was sitting in the kitchen when the bell rang. He walked to the door and opened it. Several men quickly rushed into the flat. One of them injected something into Mr. Wilson's arm and he passed out almost immediately. He was quickly wrapped up in a large bag along with his chair and carried out of the flat like furniture. The closer Samantha drove to the house, the more excitement grew within her. She paid the driver and ran to the door, rang the bell, but no one answered. Samantha stood by the door like a stumbling block. She instinctively pulled on it, and the door opened. The girl on trembling legs entered the flat. Ben was nowhere to be found, his phone lying on the floor. Nothing had been stolen, just some scattered slippers. That told me someone had been here. "Oh my God, where is he?" Samantha burst into tears. "What's happened to him again? What am I going to do?" She grabbed her phone and wanted to call the police, but instead she grabbed her bag and ran outside. She hailed a taxi and drove to Mr. Wilson's house. If they killed him, they need to hide their evidence now, Samantha reasoned. If I call the police, they'll make the whole thing discreet, and no one will ever find the culprit. It was getting dark. The girl took a wait-and-see attitude. She was sitting among the bushes, and she could see very well what was going on at Mr. Wilson's house. Kate's car came first. She drove into the yard. To all appearances, the woman went into the house. A light came on in her room on the first floor. The curtains were not closed, and Samantha saw a clear male silhouette. "It's obviously not Ben," the girl whispered. Who could it be in her room? Judging by the light in the kitchen, the servants were gone. The girl stepped aside and dialed the cook. "Hi. Are you at work?" Samantha asked. "I'm sorry, but I'm so worried. What's going on over there? Should I be looking for another job? Is the boss here?" "Oh, is that you, Samantha?" The cook finally recognized the girl. "No, the owner's not here. We're working till 12 this week, too. I don't know what's going on over there. The owner's nephew is here. He's got some business to take care of in LA. Otherwise, it's just business as usual." "Mrs. Smith's nephew?" The girl was surprised. "Who's that? I mean, where's he from?" I'd never heard of Kate having a cousin. Yes, neither had I. They say she hasn't spoken to her sister in years. And now this bloke's got some serious health problems. He's here for a checkup, and he's supposed to leave tomorrow. Samantha switched off the phone. Gradually, some puzzles began to form in her head, but she didn't fully understand who had the main role in this story. The girl called a taxi, paid the driver for a night of idle time. At 3 a.m., a car left Mr. Ben Wilson's house. Kate was behind the wheel. The taxi driver followed her. Near one house, she stopped. It was very dark, but Samantha heard the car door slam. Kate turned around and drove in the opposite direction. To Samantha's surprise, another car came out of the darkness. The girl realized the danger of her stakeout, but she had to take her chances again. For now, she couldn't figure out what she should do next. The old car drove towards the suburbs. The taxi driver and Samantha followed it. The girl was so tense that she didn't even realize where they had gone. It must have been an hour and a half when the driver dropped Samantha off on the deserted street, where the pursuing car had turned off. The girl was left alone. The taxi driver was afraid to go any further. Samantha trudged through the dark streets in terror. She listened to recognize the noise of the car. The girl was in extreme fear, her whole body trembling. The voices of dogs were heard. They were barking loudly. Samantha came to some wasteland, from which the private sector began. Suddenly, a light came on near a distant house. The girl realized it was the headlights of a car. Samantha crouched sharply near the remains of a brick wall. The car drove away and she cautiously walked to where it stood. When the headlights illuminated the street, she could clearly see a large pile near the yard. "I think it's here," she whispered. "What am I supposed to do now? If they brought Ben here, there may be someone guarding him. They'll kill me too." Samantha walked out to the vacant lot again, memorizing the house. She had a decision to make. "I'm asking you to call for a unit." Samantha called the police. "A man is missing. I think they're hiding him in the old house." Samantha's speech was so incoherent that the police accused her of playing a prank and hung up. "Are they crazy?" she said in horror. "A man could die and they don't care. They don't care." Samantha stood for a moment and dialed the police number again. This time the girl spoke more confidently. The policeman grudgingly listened to her and promised that someone would come. Samantha said she was in Railroad City. She also named the street and house where she thought Ben was hidden. The girl wrapped herself in her seasonal cloak and waited. An hour and 2 hours passed, but still no one was there. It began to get light, and Samantha called the police again. The same disgruntled voice rudely told her that the police were on their way. The girl cautiously began to make her way to the house where the car she was following had stopped. It was quiet. It seemed to Samantha that no one lived there, and the neighboring houses looked deserted. She went to the gate, wanted to enter, but a huge dog lunged at her. The girl was lucky that the dog was on a chain. Samantha cried out in fear and fell to the ground. She decided to wait until the police arrived. She was freezing hard. A cold shiver ran all over her body. "I must have a fever," Samantha thought to herself. She was shivering so much that her teeth were chattering. The girl began to dance on the spot, but it made the dog in the yard go crazy. It began to pull the chain with such force that it seemed to be about to tear it and attack the intruder. Samantha stepped aside. She paced back and forth silently until a police car appeared in the distance. Kate paced nervously around the room. Matthew was due to arrive soon. The girl was very nervous. "I'm sure he'll make it," Mrs. Caroline Smith said coldly. 2 hours had passed when the wicket gate opened and a young man entered the house. He looked very tired. "Well?" The girl ran up to him. "Did you manage to make a deal with him?" She looked hopefully into his eyes. "Yes," he said dryly. "We'll be leaving one of these days," he said to Mrs. Smith. Matthew had been living with Kate for several years. They'd started dating when she turned 18. The bloke was a good earner, and only 2 years later Kate found out what Matthew was really doing. He belonged to a gang. He didn't get his hands dirty personally, but he was involved in kidnapping, extortion, and intimidation. But recently he and the local police had a disagreement, and they began to bring criminal cases against them. For about a month the bandits tried to negotiate with the chief of police. But Matthew realized that even if they were released, they would not be able to live like before. Sooner or later they would be caught anyway. The guy had set up a few people in exchange for his freedom. It was a very complicated deal, and he managed to pull it off. But now everyone had to leave town. There was already a buyer for the house, so all they had to do was wait for Matthew to be released. The boy had said right away that they were going to New York. You could get lost there. And he was only a witness in the case, so there were no claims against him. The young couple took a flat with Mrs. Caroline Smith. They had to be very careful not to draw attention to themselves. The girl got a job as a secretary, and to be fair, Kate was good at her job. Matthew got a job as a delivery assistant and helped to deliver goods to the shops. A year went by, and it was clear that no one was going to pursue Matthew. "If we want to live well, we can't survive here on the wages Kate and I earn," Matthew once said. "Especially since Mrs. Smith can't work because of her thyroid problems." "Matthew, are you trying to do something here?" The girl was scared. "I'm afraid I almost lost you." "Why?" Kate's mother supported the boy. There are so many people here that hardly anyone will find us. And if we're very careful, I'm sure there's some easy business to be done here. Mrs. Smith had always dreamed of a life of luxury. In her head, she often pictured a 2-story house somewhere in Miami, an expensive car and foreign resorts to treat her thyroid. She didn't care at all who fulfilled her wish. Matthew seemed like a very suitable candidate for the role. After Kate had been a secretary for about a year, her mother had an idea. "Kate, what if we hooked up with your boss?" She suggested it once. "He's a scary guy. He'd be honored to have a girl like you paying attention to him." "Mum, you want me to have an affair with him?" My daughter couldn't believe her ears. "Are you crazy?" "Well, what's the big deal?" Her fiancé supported her. "It's only a few months. But then we'll have a good life. We'll buy a house in the suburbs and live like rich people." "And how do you imagine it?" The girl couldn't calm down. "I'm not going to sleep with him." Matthew, could he under some circumstances sign over the documents to the child? Mrs. Caroline Smith looked at the boy questioningly. "Well, he might be able to, but he'd take a long time to process." "You can't do that without a bed," Matthew thought. "Kate, you're not going to romance him for pleasure, but for our future." He looked at her reproachfully. It took another year for the girl to get her boss to trust her. There was no relationship between them yet. Matthew and Mrs. Smith had calculated every move. But it just so happened that a businessman met Kate by chance. "I had a crush on him. What am I supposed to do with him now?" The girl asked her boyfriend and mother when Mr. Brown asked her out. Kate also said he was single. Mrs. Smith's eyes lit up. "What if you lure him into your net and marry him?" But that would be too much. Immediately her daughter protested. "I only love Matthew. I don't want anyone else but him." "Kate, we're not going to be separated. I only love you too. And after this case, we can finally be officially married. For the sake of our happiness, I'm in." Lucky for the girl, Mr. Brown was quick to take a shine to her. What attracted him to her, Kate didn't know. Yes, she was good looking, but Mr. Ben Wilson had no one else by the time he was 35. Maybe he just projected all his dreams onto her. Anyway, the man expressed his desire to marry the girl. Hooray! Matthew, Kate, and Mrs. Caroline Smith raised their champagne glasses. "We've done it. Long live the new life." Matthew stayed in the flat they'd all rented together, and Kate and her mother moved in with Mr. Wilson. For a few years they enjoyed life, all three of them spending Ben's money on their own needs. Matthew bought himself a nice car. 3 years later, they got a big house in the suburbs. The plan was to squeeze everything they could out of Mr. Wilson, and Kate would divorce him. But the more they played, the more they worked up an appetite. Mrs. Smith had become so much the mistress of the house that she could no longer see herself without servants. Matthew dressed in expensive boutiques, and Kate did not deny herself anything. Matthew suggested that she organize a charity fund so that no one could pick on her. Ben's wife, of course, didn't spend as much money as she asked him for, but still, she was always undercover. There would be no shadow over her in a divorce, and working for her foundation gave her plenty of free time to spend with Matthew. They never went out in public together. Kate always went to his house. "So do we need to decide what to do next?" Mrs. Smith once said. "Shall we call it a day with Mr. Wilson?" Or she looked slyly at her daughter and her lover. Or Matthew repeated her words, "Do you want him gone so Kate can have all his inheritance?" "That would be nice. I just don't know how to organize it," she sighed. "He's not a poor man, he can't just get lost." "But if it's all set up perfectly, no one will suspect anything." Matthew supported Mrs. Smith. Yes, Kate didn't like the idea. She would rather just divorce Mr. Wilson. Even if he left her with nothing, they had already taken a lot from him anyway. For a long time, no plan had occurred to Mrs. Caroline Smith. All these ideas of poisoning, faulty brakes, and so on didn't fit. And when Mr. Wilson suggested that Kate should go away for the weekend, a cunning plan immediately appeared in her mind. Go-karting seemed to be the answer. Matthew had organized everything so that no one could suspect that there was anything wrong with the one cart Mr. Wilson was driving. It worked out even better than they had planned. But unfortunately, Mr. Wilson didn't die, he became an invalid. The crooks bided their time for a while so that there would be no suspicion that Ben was going to be taken out. Nearly 6 months had passed when they began to devise a plan again. How could they see it through? And this time they decided to make it look as if Mr. Wilson had been kidnapped and taken to the woods where they would find his body eaten by wolves. It was the middle of March, and hungry animals were roaming the woods looking for prey to make it happen just like that. Mr. Wilson was injected with a drug that was supposed to stop his heart. The man was euphoric after the romantic night his wife had given him. Kate did everything she could to make Ben believe her that night. Everything was going well. Everyone had the legend that Mr. Wilson reported that he was going away for a fortnight for treatment, and then he was found dead in the woods. The police begin to pursue the case. Naturally, they find no evidence. Kate, a distressed widow, receives Mr. Wilson's inheritance after a while, and there over the next 3 years she gradually disposes of Ben's money and factory. Matthew and another man he had hired took Mr. Wilson to the woods. Before doing so, the man had taken the plates off his car, and everyone was so sure that the deed was done that they were just cautiously biding their time until they found Ben's remains. "What's this?" Kate looked at her phone when she got a text message. "Oh my God, Mom, he's alive." Mrs. Smith went pale. She was so frightened she barely made it to the sofa and sat down. "What's going to happen now?" she said, terrified. For now he could tell the police everything. With trembling hands, she picked up the phone and called Matthew. The man said that he was coming to them in the guise of a relative, hired a taxi and came into the courtyard with a large bag. From the outside, it looked very plausible. Mrs. Caroline Smith ran out to meet him with tears in her eyes and introduced her nephew to someone. Everyone went into Mr. Wilson's room. "I don't think anyone suspected anything," Matthew said. "First of all, we've made it so that neither Kate nor you can have any complaints. Kate spent the night at the hotel with Mr. Wilson. And then she got a phone call from her mother. She had a heart attack, and everyone saw it. The paramedic can confirm that. So her leaving him alone won't raise any suspicions. And no one saw me further down there." It was already dark, Matthew continued. "Kate dropped me off. I looked around again. I needed to make sure it was clear. The only problem was the cafe across the street from the hotel. But at 4, there was no one there anymore. Even the waiters at the tables were asleep. What if he did see one of you?" Mrs. Smith wondered. "How?" Matthew objected. "Firstly, we were wearing masks, and secondly, none of us were talking, and lastly, he was probably unconscious. The only thing I can't figure out is how he survived. If his heart stopped, who brought him back to life? Since the police never showed up, the only option for everyone was to wait. And a few days later, Mr. Wilson turned up himself. He gave Kate the address where she was to come and see him. The woman played her part flawlessly, so Ben didn't even suspect a thing. In fact, he didn't even realize anything. When 2 people he couldn't even see ran into the flat, Mr. Wilson felt something sticking into his arm. His head immediately felt heavy and his eyelids felt leaden. Ben woke up in some dark place, lying on the floor and feeling damp. He tried to raise himself but could not. After a while, his eyes adjusted and he began to recognize the walls. To all appearances, it was a cellar or some other underground room. Mr. Wilson felt the ground with his hands. "My God, what's happened to me?" Ben muttered faintly. "How did I get here? Someone stole me from the flat." He began to recall what had happened to him. Mr. Wilson tried to stand up, leaning against the wall. He couldn't feel his legs. Eventually, he succeeded. Who were these people? His head rang like a bell. Every question resonated with pain. Who could have known where I was? Samantha. I wondered if she had organized all this. A shiver ran through Mr. Wilson's whole body. He seemed to have stopped breathing. But then why did she save me? He clutched his head with his hands. What did she want with me? No, Samantha couldn't have done it. Maybe Andrew followed her. That's right. He saw her hanging around the factory and followed her. Maybe they're in on it together. The ideas that came into Mr. Wilson's head were so heavy that he could hardly bear them. The man settled on the fact that his deputy and his carer had organized the whole thing. What do they want me to do? His brain kicked in again. Could they be plotting to blackmail Kate? Kate? He repeated out loud. She was supposed to be coming to see me. Kate, he said, as if someone had hit him over the head with all their might. Why didn't she come? I was expecting her. Maybe I got the wrong address, Mr. Wilson began to remember. No, I told her the right thing. He searched his pockets, but they were empty. Mr. Wilson felt how cold he was. His whole body was shaking from the cold. I'm going to freeze to death out here, he thought, and started shouting, "Hey, somebody let me out of here. Help." But there was silence all around. "Oh God, help me," Mr. Wilson cried out. His brain was spinning again with tremendous force. Panic and fear began to provoke new thoughts in him. Why didn't Kate come? Mr. Wilson thought. Where is she? Why didn't she save me? Something came to the very surface of his brain and hit him like a blast wave. Kate knew my exact address. A clue pierced him. Did she? Mr. Wilson froze in shock at his thoughts. It seemed to him that everything was jumbled up in his head. But after a moment it became completely clear. My wife did it, he said aloud to someone. She knew where I was. If Samantha had wanted to kill me, she could have taken me here right after the hospital. No one would have noticed I was gone. It was very difficult for Mr. Wilson to accept what had occurred to him. It meant that from the very beginning Kate had been impersonating another person. She had never loved him. The latter was so painful that it seemed to Mr. Wilson his heart would burst from grief. Matthew got out of the taxi, pressed the intercom. The gate opened automatically, and he quietly entered the house. "Give me my bag," he said to Kate and Mrs. Caroline Smith. "I think he'll make it tonight. He won't last long in the cellar. Then we'll take him to the woods as planned. And then the wolves will finish the job." "And if he's still alive?" Mr. Wilson's wife said in a frightened voice. "What would we do then? Or would the owners of the house be there?" "Then we'll take him there alive," replied the man. "Only now we'll leave him deep in the woods. The owner of the house won't be back until early summer, so no one will come there for a long time." "That's it, I'm leaving you. Let's pretend to the servants that I've done all my chores." Matthew hugged his aunt and said goodbye to Kate. The landlady escorted him to the gate, and he set off with a large bag to the bus stop. The man called a taxi on the way and went to his house in the suburbs. His work was almost finished. This time he had no doubt that they would succeed. Samantha ran towards the police car. She was so cold she could barely speak. "That's the house over there. Check it out. There's a big dog in the yard," the girl said in a shaky voice. "I think they hid him there." Who? The policeman could not understand. They cautiously began to make their way towards the house. One of them climbed over the fence. Despite the barking, the dog couldn't reach him. The other followed. Samantha was crying, her head was buzzing from exertion. She wanted to go into the yard again, but the dog pounced on her. It must have been an hour when one of the policemen appeared near the fence. He drove the dog away with a big stick, while the other pulled on Mr. Wilson's old sheet. The man groaned. "Ben." Samantha rushed to him. "Lord, why did I leave you alone?" The girl fussed over her master. The police took the man and Samantha to their flat. Here Mr. Wilson lay down on the bed and finally, under several blankets, was able to get warm. Samantha immediately made hot tea for everyone. "Well, let's do the paperwork, shall we?" suggested the sergeant. "It's a long case, so we'd better get started." It took Mr. Wilson and Samantha almost 3 hours to give their statements. The police took notes. Finally, they summarized. "So apart from your wife, no one else knew where you were." The sergeant looked at Mr. Wilson. "We're not counting Samantha." "I guess so," agreed Mr. Ben Wilson. "I haven't had any other calls since my call." "Samantha says she saw your wife with a man outside the hotel," the policeman said to the girl. "Even though it was dark, you could see that he was kissing her?" The man called someone at the station and talked for a long time. Then he went back into the room. "We'll go back to that house," he said. "I don't think they'll be there during the day, but they'll be there in the evening or at night. And we'll wait for them there. Please don't call anyone until we get the situation straightened out." The police left and the owner and the carer were left alone. The man felt guilty. "Samantha, "I'm sorry, it's all my fault," Mr. Wilson confessed. "I couldn't take it at first and texted my wife. And then when you went to the factory, I called her and asked her to come over. You know, I had a feeling it was her from the beginning," the girl sighed. "Thank God I was able to find you, Lord. It's a good thing I went straight to your house and followed that car. You've already saved me twice. Thank you." Tears ran down Mr. Wilson's cheeks. "God sent you to me. It's a good thing I stood up for you to Mrs. Caroline Smith. I left you. I can't imagine what would have happened if I hadn't hired you back then. I'd be lying in my grave by now." Samantha looked at him. She had been through so much herself these days. The girl walked over to her master and hugged him. The stress made her cry too. It was 12 when a car pulled up to the abandoned house. 2 men got out. One threw a piece of meat to the dog and it stopped barking. The silhouettes followed the house. Someone opened the lock and the 2 figures began to descend cautiously into the cellar. Near the door itself, one thug switched on a torch. The other opened the door and stepped inside. The lantern twitched all around the room, but there was no one inside. Matthew was scared out of his wits. He quickly turned round and wanted to run outside, but suddenly 3 policemen appeared in front of them. Against the wall, one of them said, pointing his gun, "Don't move. You won't get away." Mr. Ben Wilson's case had been going on for months. Lawyers for Kate, her mom, and Matthew tried to find some loopholes. They did find something. The ex-wife and her mother got suspended sentences, but Matthew had to go to jail this time. The fraudsters lost all the property they'd bought with Mr. Wilson's money. The dreams of a wealthy life meant that even Mrs. Caroline Smith now had to work. No one cared about the state of her thyroid. The only problem was that with a suspended sentence, women couldn't get any more or less decent jobs. Kate and her mother had worked several jobs, washing large production areas. But unfortunately, no matter how much life taught them, still Mrs. Smith and Kate did not think they were to blame. After Mr. Ben Wilson returned home, changes began to take place in his life too. The first thing the man did was take a realistic look at his health. And since there was no positive prognosis, the man decided to sell his factory after all. Andrew and another of his employees bought it back in installments. "I am glad that my brainchild will belong to you," Mr. Wilson confessed to his former colleagues. "In your hands, my factory will be under your care. I am sure that in a few years you will have achieved much more than I did." Despite the sadness of losing his enterprise, Mr. Wilson sighed peacefully after a few months. He had enough money for a long, prosperous life. But the most important thing Mr. Wilson had gained from the whole affair was a trusted and loyal friend. Samantha accompanied her master all the way to the end of the case. For a while she was still afraid that something else might happen to Mr. Wilson. But after Matthew was put away and Kate and Mrs. Smith were punished, Mr. Wilson kept his promise as promised. "Samantha, what do you think of this picture?" Mr. Wilson stopped beside the blue dancers. "What stunning colors. I adore this painting." Samantha took his hand and together they looked at the mesmerizing figures of the girls in the blue dresses. Samantha no longer doubted that Mr. Wilson had ceased to be her master who gave her work. He had become her friend and her favorite person. "Samantha, what do you think of this painting?" Mr. Wilson stopped next to the blue dancers. "What stunning colors. I adore this painting." Samantha took his hand and together they looked at the mesmerizing figures of the girls in the blue dresses. Samantha no longer doubted that Mr. Wilson had ceased to be her master who gave her work. He had become to her a friend and a favorite man. Ben had been hesitant to propose to his carer for a long time, and it wasn't that he didn't believe her feelings. "Maybe she'll find someone better than me," he thought. "After all, I'm an invalid and she'll have to be a carer for the rest of her life." The man was torn between his feelings for the girl and his common sense. One day he plucked up the courage to talk to Samantha about his love. "Samantha," said Ben, "you mean too much to me, and I'm very afraid of losing you. I need you to understand me." Wilson tried to explain something. "Ben, I love you," she smiled. "Let's not make this any harder than it has to be. If you care about me, let's not make up some excuse to break up." "Let's not," agreed Ben Wilson. "I love you too. Marry me." Suddenly he said, "If you have no more doubts about anything, I'll answer you at once." "Yes," the girl laughed. Ben and Samantha married and had a little holiday for themselves. And only at the end of the summer their parents flew in. "What's up?" Ben's father raised his glass. "Our children have been through so much, but these problems have hardened their union. Now we can be sure that no circumstances in their lives will not be able to separate them." That was the message the newlyweds began to live by. Samantha did everything possible so that her Ben did not feel detached from life. They visited many interesting places together, and when their daughter was born, Ben was finally able to fully experience what it was like to have a family. "Disability can only limit you when you want it to," Ben Wilson liked to say. "And I can safely say that I have a lot more opportunities than the average person." Jennifer grew up in a poor village, so it's not surprising that she always dreamed of living in the city. This dream was encouraged by her mother. "Go, Jessica. At least you'll live like a human being. At least they'll make you wash pots there. It's better in winter than to be lost here. The young people are all running away, and you're as good as anyone else." Jennifer hoped that a better fate awaited her in the city. She dreamed of becoming a nurse. Of course, she dreamed of becoming a doctor, but she realized that it would be very difficult, if not impossible, to learn. She didn't dream of going to college. She thought she could do it at school. But when she came to the city, she realized that she couldn't do it either. Yes, she finished school quite well, but it was a rural school. The level of education there left much to be desired. Her B's and A's didn't mean much if in many subjects they were taught by an elderly teacher who gave marks just out of kindness, not knowing all the subtleties. After evaluating her options, Jennifer thought she could prepare for and enter college, but it didn't work out. After 10 years in the city, she realized that her mother was right. She had to work as an orderly in a hospital, washing pots there. Jennifer did not escape the sad fate of many provincials. She had a son, Jason, without marriage. His father she met by chance. Youth was taking its toll, and Jennifer realized, with a companion to get through easier. Naively, she hoped that there would be a husband, a support. But her lover disappeared when Jennifer was pregnant. There were rumors he died, but she didn't know for sure. What did it matter if they weren't married? There was no alimony or pension. She had to make do with allowances and a nurse's salary. After years of wandering through hostels and barracks, she was lucky enough to get a room with the elderly Elizabeth, who treated her well. Although Elizabeth was often sick, Jennifer helped her around the house. In return, the landlady looked after Jason while Jennifer was at work and kept up with the rent. Jennifer resigned herself to living in poverty and loneliness, but it was still better than her home village. She'd only been back there once, for her mother's funeral, after which she'd sold the house for next to nothing for firewood. "Okay, we didn't live rich. There's nothing to get used to," Jennifer sighed as she received her paycheck. She felt sorry for her son. Why should he live in poverty? At school, he was often made fun of because he didn't have not only excesses, but even the things he needed for school. It wasn't just his classmates who made fun of Jason. Even the teacher didn't feel sorry for the child, reprimanding him and reprimanding Jennifer. When they announced another fundraiser at the assembly, she was always short. She promised to bring it back later. But where was she going to get some? "I completely understand, Jennifer, but this is not my whim. It's a school-wide requirement. So try to give as soon as possible," the teacher said, pressing her thin lips together. Other moms also looked at her judgmentally. Everyone understood, but that didn't make it any easier. It wasn't easy for a single mom. In such situations, she imagined what it was like for her son. But what could she do? Jennifer worked a part-time job, taking extra shifts, taking care of the sick beyond what she was supposed to for a small fee, but it was too little. Jason understood. The smart, good boy was doing well in school and didn't give his mother any trouble. He didn't reproach her for always being short and didn't demand too much. He didn't even complain about being bullied at school, but he was so abused that he sometimes ran away. And how could you blame him if he always lacked something? I didn't want to go home, but I couldn't upset Elizabeth. Let her think he just didn't want to learn. She'd still be unhappy that he'd run away, because she'd always told him to obey his teachers, to respect them, and to live by the rules. Otherwise, it could be like her son Andrew. Elizabeth had a son, but unfortunately he was in prison. She was sure that Andrew was not guilty of anything. He had just been framed. I mean, he never took anyone else's money. She often complained to Jennifer. He was always nice, respectful. But there are a lot of bad people. He worked on the farm. Everyone was happy with him. And then he was set up. He was accused of embezzling a large sum of money. Where's that money? You saw we were living paycheck to paycheck. I didn't have money for a good lawyer. It was clear to everyone that he was framed. But how to prove it? I'm afraid to even think about what will happen to him in prison. What if he dies? Jennifer tried to reassure her. Don't say that. When your son comes back, you'll be in better health. But Elizabeth, with her small pension, couldn't borrow either. She rented out her room to collect money to send to her son in prison, or to send him money, because it's even harder there than it is here, she said. How does a mother not ache for her only son? Jennifer understood that very well, and little Jason also tried not to upset Grandma Elizabeth. Once again, having run away from school, he went not home, but to his mother's work. But he didn't say why he left early. He said the last gym class was canceled. But Jennifer realized what was wrong. Jason didn't have the right uniform for gym class. His sneakers were torn, and he couldn't buy new ones yet, so Jennifer didn't scold him. She patted him on the head and decided it wouldn't be a big deal if he sat in the back room until her shift was over. Gregory Lyon, the head of the department, upon seeing the boy, expressed his displeasure. But what is this called? Outsiders walking around the ward. This is a hospital after all, not something out there. Fine, if you're in a desperate situation, let him escort her out, but not walking all over the ward. But sitting in the back quietly and not bothering anyone, Jennifer assured him that his son wasn't going anywhere. He's quiet, calm, but how do you make a boy sit in one place? Especially in a new place where everything is interesting. Meanwhile, in the department we have not only rooms for all patients, but also a few paid separate rooms, where people who can pay for treatment lie. They're the ones I'm mostly worried about. That's it. Gregory Lyon, the rich have their quirks. They may not like to see a boy walking around the hospital who has nothing to do with the sick or the doctors. And anyway, the child doesn't belong here, Jennifer sternly ordered Jason to sit in the back room. You have your notebooks with you. Why don't you sit and do your homework or read something? Otherwise we'll both get kicked out. The boy obeyed his instructions faithfully. But then he went out of the back room to visit the toilet. In the corridor he caught such a scene from one of the patients from the very ward to which he could not even come close. That is, from the paid ward. A very beautiful and dressy woman came out. The boy even froze with amazement. It seemed to him that it was some kind of artist. Behind her a man was sticking to the wall. There is no time. Maxim, you'll have to forgive me, she said hurriedly. She kissed the patient, told him to get well, and hurriedly walked toward the exit. The man looked at her, embarrassed, then shifted his gaze to Jason. What are you doing here, kid? Is someone sick? No, my mom works here, the boy replied. I came to see her. Could you help me to my bed, please? My legs don't walk at all. I'll just lean on you a little so I don't fall. Jason, of course, walked the man over, helped him to the bed, and stared at him again with his mouth hanging open. This time he was surprised by the collection of strange figures on the nightstand. They were animals, birds, little men, but the strangest thing was that they were all made of colored paper. Apparently it had been folded somehow, and such interesting things had come out. He'd never seen anything like it. Do you like my zoo? The man asked with a smile. Very much, replied the boy. How are the live ones? Do you make them yourself? Yes, and I learned myself once when I was a child, when I was like you. And ever since then I have been folding them, sometimes out of nothing to do. It's called origami. Would you like me to teach you? Can I do that? I really want to, but I don't think I can do it. Why not? I did it. Here, look how it's done. The man pulled another piece of orange paper from the stack and began folding it. Jason was moving so fast that he didn't have time to follow his hands. But soon enough, the simple piece of paper produced a sitting ginger cat. Here's your cat, he handed the figure to the boy. Wow, I didn't even notice how you did it. No, I can't do that. I was the one who held the weightless kitty in the palm of my hand for you. Come by sometime and I'll teach you how to do it too. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to get some sleep, said Max Irving. Thank you very much. I'd love to come in, but they won't let me. But I don't mind. Just tell them I invited you. My name is Max Irving, by the way. You can call me Uncle Max. Just say that if anyone asks if I said it was okay. I'm Jason Ann. My mom's Jennifer. She works here as a nurse. Why don't you tell them you said I could come in too? I'll get scolded and my mom might get fired, the boy worried. Don't worry. I'll tell them I'm inviting you. It's boring here alone. So Jason started coming over often. Max Irving, who really told everyone that he and the boy were friends, and he had nothing against it. The nurses didn't like this friendship very much. They knew that the patient lying in this ward was a very rich man, but apparently really lonely. Yes, he had a beautiful wife, but she came rarely and for a very short time, explaining her absence by her busyness. They said she was busy with the affairs of the company, while her husband was ill. No wonder the sick man is bored alone. And the boy, who clearly lacks male companionship, since he never knew his father, reached out to him precisely because of these unconscious considerations. Max Irving, after all, enjoyed making his little friend. But here was when the boy would miss him. Besides, Jennifer knew from the talk of the doctors and nurses that this patient was about to undergo a difficult operation which he might well not survive. Well, why all this talk? Because of Jason, she thought, but she didn't mind. After all, let her son have some joy. Jason was really getting into origami, and he was even starting to make some of the figures, and additional lessons will not hurt him. After all, Jennifer had no money to send her son to any classes. School classes alone are not enough for general development, so it would not hurt. Then, however, it turned out that she was worried for a reason, although not quite what she should have been worried about. After all, in one of the paid wards there was trouble. One of the patients lost a cell phone of the latest model, very expensive. What's so surprising, said one of the nurses. There's a lot of people hanging around the ward. The hospital has become a thoroughfare. She was referring, of course, to Jason. She didn't like the boy coming to his mother. She thought it was an unacceptable indulgence on the part of management. The boy was immediately questioned. He swore, of course, that he hadn't gone into that patient's room and hadn't taken anything. But who would believe him? Fortunately, Max Irving himself stood up for him. He said that the boy had really only come to see me and had not been anywhere else all this time. And in general, I do not understand why you are attached to the child. I told you he'd be coming to my place. Well, he's coming over. Why does someone have a problem with something again? Like he's throwing his stuff around, or he's a thief, or he's cleaning it up. And it's the fault of the kid who wasn't around. Jason was dropped, and the phone was found somewhere. Jennifer wanted to already categorically forbid her son to come to the hospital, but the same thing. The sick man asked her not to. You'll have to excuse me, but your son and I have really become friends, and I do feel better when I talk to someone. I have to take my mind off my illness. And Jason, your smart guy, is really interesting with her. Jennifer knew that the patient's condition was worsening, mostly perhaps because he was afraid of the upcoming surgery, and his wife was coming in less and less often. And several times there were rumors that she was not coming alone, but some man in a car dropping her off. That is, the woman, most likely, is not very much waiting for the recovery of her spouse and agrees even to another option. And seeing that her son also misses his adult friend, she lets Jason drop by Uncle Max's house. You see, he's really going to have surgery. It's hard for him. He's in pain right now. You should cheer him up somehow, Jennifer asked. Yeah, I'm trying, Jason said. And I don't talk to him about anything sad, just the good stuff. Well, good for you, the mother said, and began to look into Max Irving's room more often too, seeing the genuine support of this family. The patient once addressed them with a rather strange request. You see, I have a serious operation to perform, and even the doctors do not hide the fact that I may not be able to bear it. And if that's the case, it wouldn't hurt to think about a will. I've decided to videotape it on my phone. Please record it and give it to the notary. I'll give you the address, Jennifer, of course. Agreed. So she and Jason recorded Max Irving's last will and testament on the phone he gave them. The boy got seriously excited. It's Mom, Uncle Max isn't going to die, is he? What do you think? Anxious, he asked. I don't know, honey. I don't know. Let's hope everything will be all right, replied Jennifer, who already knew that the chances of the sick man were slim, especially since he was already thinking about a will. Too bad for him, he was a young man. To live, as she left hospital with the phone on which the sick man's will was written. She was met by Max Irving's wife, Diane. She already knew Jennifer was caring for her husband, so she turned to the nurse. How is he? She asked nonchalantly. Still alive. No surgery. Diana did not believe that her husband would recover. She had already talked to the doctor and learned that the chances were slim. And in fact, other than Jennifer and her son, few people believed in Max Irving's recovery. No, the surgery is scheduled for tomorrow. I think she told Diane we have good doctors. It should go fine. Besides, your husband is still a young man. He's really worried, though. You'll have to support him somehow. He even made a will on his cell phone. I'm going to the notary right now. I'll show him. Well, Diana perked up. Show me. She looked and found out that he bequeathed all the assets in the company to her. She almost danced with joy. It was just what she needed. She took the phone. So don't go to any notary, I'll go myself. It's our own business, she said. And don't say anything to Max, and I support him. And don't worry, everything will be fine. Jennifer gave the smartphone to Diana without a second thought and decided, since she didn't have to go to the notary, to go to church and pray for Max Irving, who was sick and was about to undergo a complicated surgery. Diana dropped in on her husband, chatted with him for 5 minutes and ran to the notary, but not to the one her husband had asked her to go to, but to another one who could dispose of this will in a much more favorable way. She was sure her husband's hours were already numbered, and now she would be a rich, cheerful widow, all the more so because she already had someone who was ready to replace her husband in every way. And that man was at least a reliable substitute for her husband. Ethan had been paying Diana's attention for a long time, but as long as her husband had been healthy, she'd been cautious. And now that he was about to die, what was there to lose? She didn't know how to live alone. She didn't want to do the business of the firm, although she had some education. So the new husband had to be both smart and reliable. That way, not much would change in her life. She will again become the wife of a solid man, a business owner, also in a way dependent on her. The young woman was confident in her lover's feelings and in the power of her charms. But now that she would be even richer, everything would work out just fine for her. It would be good if the notary could arrange it so that she could take her rights early, without having to wait for Max Irving's death. Of course, she'll have to share it with him, but that's all right. I've got more spending to do. What can I do? She's a woman. That's why she has a husband. One dies, another one comes along. What else can she do? I wonder how long I have to mourn, how long before I can get married. I don't really want to wait that long, she thought. She'd been living with Ethan without any marriage, but it's not right. When the notary heard about the fee, he was willing to help. But there was a hitch. Max Irving survived. Yes, he was still in a serious condition, and there was no guarantee that he would recover. But even the fact that he was alive was an unpleasant surprise to his wife. as well as Jessica's deputy on all fronts, and even the notary. But for Jennifer and Jason, on the contrary, they were very happy that the man they had already come to sympathize with would probably recover soon. Yes, it's still a long way off, but there is hope, and the prospects are much better than they were before. Another event took place in the life of mother and son. Elizabeth's son was released from the colony. When she learned that she would soon be able to see him at home, the old woman flew like on wings, forgetting about her illnesses and looking 10 years younger. She was happy. Jennifer, on the other hand, was not expecting anything good from this event. Of course, she tried to hide her feelings from her mistress, helped her with the cleaning of the apartment, with the purchase of food for the solemn meeting of a man she did not know at all. But Elizabeth noticed her mood. Why does Jennifer seem so downcast? What am I getting excited about? Everything has become, as they say, blue and green for me, she said. But I noticed that there's something wrong with you. No, not at all. Elizabeth, I'm very happy for you and your son. I was just thinking that Jason and I will have to look for another place to live. It's very difficult for me right now, Jennifer explained her condition. Yes, the Lord is with you. Why? The landlady marveled. I never thought of asking you to leave. I've grown accustomed to you as kin. Or are you afraid of the fact that my son is a prisoner after all? What did he pick up behind bars there? What bad habits? Don't even think about it. He's still the same as he was, she said. No, I didn't think that for a minute. You've told me about him. I believe your Andrew has remained an honest and decent man. It's just that we're occupying his room now. I mean, we'll have to vacate it. And anyway, he might not like having strangers and a baby living next door, Jennifer said. Well, I wrote to him about you, Jason, and he doesn't mind. We have 3 rooms. The little one next to the kitchen is good enough for me, so don't even think about moving. In the meantime, Elizabeth's son had returned, met the new tenants, and turned out to be a really nice man who had been little affected by several years in a penal colony among criminals, though thoughts of revenge against those who had put him behind bars did not leave him. Andrew met and quickly found a common language with Jason, took a keen interest in his affairs, and going into his room, was surprised by the figures made of paper. He admired the boy's skill, and asked him who had taught him to make such things. And this is in the hospital where Mom works. There is a man lying there. Uncle Max, I go in to see him, and he teaches me. He's even better at it. He made this cat, and these parrots Andrew was wary. He knew Max, the origami enthusiast. He'd worked on Max Irving's farm. He thought he was the reason he was in prison. But he didn't think it was appropriate to talk to the kid about it. So, after a moment, he spoke to Jennifer. I'd like to visit your hospital. Set me up a meeting with this Max Irving. But don't worry, I'm not going to have any kind of showdown there. I just want to look him in the eye, he asked, telling me what business was making him want this meeting. Oh, Andrew, is that necessary? I realize you have a grudge against this man, but still, think for yourself. He's in a pretty serious condition right now, just out of surgery. I think you'd better wait until he's discharged. Who knows? How will this meeting end for him? Jennifer tried to talk him out of it. Well, yes, you're right. He'll go to a resort somewhere to improve his health, and when he comes back, you won't be able to get near him through security. I tell you, I'm not going to do anything bad to him. I'm not going to fight or even quarrel with the sick man. I'll just tell him I know all about his affairs and see how he reacts no matter how hard Alicia tried to prevent this meeting. Andrew insisted, and she realized that he would get to the ward anyway, and then the matter could end in a serious scandal. In the end, Jennifer agreed, said when and how it would be most convenient to see the patient, taking an oath that everything would be peaceful. And so it was. Andrew, unnoticed by anyone, entered the room, saw the man he considered his enemy, and was amazed. So bad was the man he remembered as blooming and full of vigor, but he was not going to express sympathy for him. Well, Max, do you remember me, or have you forgotten? I remember. So why did you work for us? Then something happened. What happened was you sent me to prison for 5 years. That's what happened. No way, by the way, and it seemed like the right thing to do. You got the money. I did all the time, like I had my best interests at heart. I don't know what you mean. I didn't even do it. I wasn't even in court. It was my deputy who exposed you. I testified afterward. Isn't that right? So I had nothing to do with it. Of course, now you can blame anyone. You're the boss. So everything comes from you. You knew it wasn't my fault. I didn't know that. The fact that you allegedly embezzled the money for that deal was reported by whom? Not me. I didn't testify. Ethan was in charge of the finances. I was in charge of the organization. And anyway, I don't know what you want now. You had to prove your innocence earlier in court, and now what difference does it make whether I believe you or not? I understand you've already served your time. What now? Andrew looked at his former boss. He had turned even paler, sweat beading on his forehead. Apparently this conversation had exhausted the sick man, and it was not remorse but his own plight that tormented him. It was simply uncomfortable to talk to a man in such a state. Well, I guess he'll get his without me. He's breathing down his neck, thought the visitor, and left the room. He ran into a very beautiful woman, the wife of the chief. Yes, it was Diana. She had heard Andrew's conversation with Max Irving and realized that this man could help her in getting rid of her husband, who did not want to die. "Oh, so you're the one who went to jail for bribery," then she whispered. She caught Andrew by the sleeve. "And you believe him? I know perfectly well that it was my husband who did everything to get you locked up. You, of course, as an honorable man, decided to forgive a sick man. He's not sick at all. He's faking it. He didn't just set you up. He's got 30 or 40 enemies, and he's lying to everyone like this. You shouldn't listen to his lies, but deal with him like a man." "So what? Do I like it with him when he's lying like that?" replied the astonished Andrew. "Strange things you say? Well, why fight? There are plenty of ways to punish a man somehow. Well, to punish him for his misdeeds, you know. He's lying there in the tubes, disconnect something and it's over. Or you could slip him something." "Thanks. I've been in jail before. Let the 40-40s do that, and I'll do it," Andrew muttered, ripped her manicured fingers from his sleeve, and went on his way, marveling at the callousness of his former boss's wife. God must have punished him not only with illness, but also with such a wife. It's a lot to think about, he thought, and no one noticed Jason standing nearby, who had heard the whole conversation. That was how she'd helped raise Jason. She was always ready to offer advice, motherly pity. She was the one who had to be buried, not his own mother. Jennifer felt truly orphaned. She was now the primary adult in her life and Jason's. It wasn't the elderly Elizabeth who was pitied. It wasn't the son who wasn't happy all the way through. Due to the funeral, Jennifer didn't come to work for a few days, and when she returned, she learned a terrible thing. Max Irving overestimated his strength, decided to walk on his own. As a result, he hit his head and fell into a coma. This gave his wife new hope. She was sure that now her husband would definitely die. She was already tired of waiting for this sad event. As far as her lover was concerned, too, the doctors had explained to her that Max Irving had a chance, albeit tiny, of recovery, so there's no way to take him off life support right away. We have to wait. If he stays like this much longer, you know what I mean. Diana didn't want to lose face even in this situation. She tried to make it look good. But he's suffering. We don't know how he feels being in that state. Maybe it makes sense to let him go. Do we have the right to torture a man when he's completely helpless? She said, breaking her arms. I understand, and in some ways you may be right, but everyone has the right to live. I know, and I don't insist on anything. But keeping him alive must cost money, and I don't have any. He's been ill for so long. The firm's gone under. I have practically nothing to live on. For the time being, he'll be supported by the state. But of course, it can't go on indefinitely, the doctor said reassuringly. But Diana, in fact, already felt like a widow. Not now, so in a week her husband would finally die. So she could feel like a free woman. Now she had access to all her assets and could deny herself nothing, and she did. True, in her naivete and self-confidence, she'd let Ethan use everything. But for the time being, everything was as it should be. True, the lover sooner got tired of waiting. For a week, a month and a half had passed, and Max Irving lay there, neither conscious nor dying. You understand, something so it will start soon, and we will be left with nothing, the lover said unhappily. So what am I going to do? Not kill him? I don't want to sit in jail, Diana justified herself. And who pays for his stay in the hospital? Am I? Would you at least think about what it would mean for us? Ethan boiled. Am I crazy? Spend money on something like this? I don't know who's paying for it. The head doctor is not talking to me. He either suspects something or just angry that I persuaded to disconnect my husband. Humanists. Now they probably pay for everything out of humanity, and we have to suffer. How can we expect them to be humane? They cut the unhealthy ones without thinking twice. You're the one who's messing with my head. You're probably hoping that your beloved will wake up. You want to go back to him. You should have told me so. I don't mess with my head. I'm wasting my time with you. Are you scared, Dimochka? Diana, don't say that. You're the most precious thing to me. You can see it yourself. I only want to be with you. It was true. Despite all her dexterity and unscrupulousness, Diana realized that quickly find a new man who would be so well versed in business and agreed to take her as a wife will not be possible. And the search may not end at all as desired. There's the risk of being left alone with no money. But for some reason, she trusted Ethan. Turns out she shouldn't have. He'd had enough of his mistress, who'd been too self-important before. And now, having intercepted her husband's money, she got naked. As a result, one day Ethan simply disappeared with all the money that Diana already considered his. She was left with nothing. Her husband is not sure if he'll survive or not, and if he did, wouldn't she be held responsible for the missing money? And a lot of other things. The lover had disappeared in an unknown direction. Diana's only solace was alcohol. She didn't know who was making sure Max Irving stayed on life support and why. And that was Jennifer and Andrew. During that time, they managed to get married. Andrew got a job. But Jennifer couldn't forget about Max being in such dire straits. She realized that she had nothing to do with this man. Besides, she was a married woman now. Still, she couldn't leave Max without help. You don't think anything of the sort. But I can't leave him, Jennifer told her husband, and he, oddly enough, agreed with her. You know, I feel the same way. You can't do that. I mean, to let a person just die like that. Maybe I'm the reason it happened. But I didn't come until after his surgery. So I rushed to apologize, to prove that I wasn't the reason he was in that position. So let's do what we can. There are enough people who want him dead without us. We'll do the opposite, save a life. See if it counts somewhere. And so, while they had the opportunity, they paid for Max's stay in the clinic. Then they started to get some quotas and attracted volunteers. Only thanks to this, Max Irving got the opportunity not only to live, but also to recover. As a result, he came out of his coma. A year of being between life and death was not in vain. He still had a long way to go to fully recover, but there were doctors who were also interested in the fact that such a heavy patient still stood on his feet. And Max himself was not going to remain an invalid. Besides, his memory was not lost. He remembered everything that preceded the illness. He also remembered the role his wife had played in what had happened. He decided beforehand that he wouldn't stay with her. Now that he knew what kind of person Diana was, he felt nothing but disgust for her. Diane, by all accounts, had already buried her husband. During his stay in a coma, she only visited the doctor to find out when Max would finally die, and now she was in no hurry to visit him. Did Max Irving have bad news for her? But Diana was in no hurry to come. For one thing, she still hoped that her husband was now almost an ex-husband, and even if he didn't die, he'd become severely disabled, which meant she'd get at least the firm, which wasn't bad either. She was not going to work, but she could sell it and live well on the proceeds. In any case, not worse than on the crumbs that could be obtained from the sale of the remnants of former luxury. She had already reached the point of selling things. The money from that was very little. She had friends and girlfriends who helped her to drink the proceeds. In addition, taking advantage of her condition, they did not hesitate to steal from her. At some point, Diana, having learned that her husband survived and even recovers, decided to visit him. Who but Max Irving could help her in her pitiful condition? She hoped very much that he would forgive her. After all, he had loved her so much. Besides, the young woman still counted on the fact that she had some influence over him. And did he remember much from the past? She thought hopefully. Then one day a nurse asked Max Irving, "Is your wife here to see you?" "They want to see her, so you can talk to her." Visits were generally forbidden. Only the staff were allowed in his room. How did everyone know about your wife? The relationship was ambiguous. Well, where to go? We had to do it anyway. Let her come in. Diana entered the room timidly, with an unhappy smile. Small steps approached, almost crept up to her husband's bed. Cautiously sat down on the edge of the chair and whispered, "Hello, Max, hello." "You sit down like that, tentatively, or something." Jumped up, a little squeamishly, her husband said. She giggled timidly. "I'm so glad you're joking. It means you're getting better. Why the tirade?" "You think I'm going to thank you for what I've done?" Max asked dryly. The wife became agitated. "What are you scolding me for?" Diana stammered. "Honey, well, won't you forgive me? I've been hurt, too, haven't I? That scoundrel Ethan, you were right to call him sneaky. He cheated me, too. And I was in such a terrible state, crying all the time, always alone. And you were on the verge of life and death. And then he first seemed to sympathize, and then promised that he would double, triple his fortune. Don't you give a shit? You're making my ears ring." Her husband cut her off irritably. "It's disgusting to listen to you, Diana." "Well, don't be like that." Max already tearfully, she dragged on. "You must understand and forgive me. Yes, I understand you perfectly well. Too bad it's too late to forgive something like that. However, we'll talk about that later when I'm discharged in front of my lawyer. For now, if you would be so kind as to go out." "I'm tired and feeling very ill," he replied. "Well, honey, I'm your wife. I'm supposed to be with you. I'll help." Diana clamored. "What do you want me to do? Strangle the tubes shut off? Slip in some kind of nasty drug? Have I heard about your plans? Don't make me call security. You don't want to be let out under arms." He reached for some kind of button. That's it. "I'm leaving now." She tried to hug him, but ran into Max's gaze, recoiled understandingly, and hurriedly retreated to the door. When she left the room, it was as if she'd shed her humble mask, her face contorted with anger. "All right, Max, all right. We'll talk in front of the lawyer and the prosecutor. He's the one who was scaring me with the divorce. We'll see what happens. I'm gonna have to go in there every day. I wonder if he'll really get discharged. That snake is tenacious. I'm gonna have to start trusting him again. And the main thing is to deal with Ethan, the bastard. If not even to return the money, at least to release his guts." But alas, Diana had neither acquaintances to whom she could appeal with such a request, nor money to pay for the services of vigilantes. She sat down on a bench in the hospital park, took out a flask of cognac, sipped it. Her mood improved expectantly. She remembered something important, and that man was a criminal. He wanted to deal with Max. That man said he had nothing to do with it. He should be brought in after all. These prisoners are clever people. Let him find him and talk to him properly. But where could I find the bandit himself? During these thoughts, Jennifer managed to take a drink, which gave her courage and awakened some memories. She remembered that the person she was looking for had something to do with the local nurse, or nurse, as Jennifer called her again. She had gotten the address of this very employee from the Hardy Medics and had gone to see her, but it turned out to be quite simple. Jennifer wasn't home. The door was opened by the same ex-convict who lived with her, drunk as always. Jennifer was eloquent and persuasive. So, he changed his mind about killing my boyfriend. That's good for you, of course. It wasn't Max Irving's fault. I looked into it. He's got some connections. And you've decided to forgive everyone else. Well, yours really isn't. Where's the guy who put me up to all this? I don't even know. If you did, you'd tell me. Andrew's a little wary. I don't want someone like you to find him. Tell me. You're afraid, just say so. The guests excitedly encouraged. You must keep your tongue to find him. You need to know who, how, and where, and I don't know. But you're good. You need to point your finger at him, then you'll find him. That's the way I'd find him. But I'm a woman, you see. What can I do? I can only give you a little guidance. I mean, he's been ripping me off. I don't care about the money. We'd have to take care of him ourselves. So Diana tipped Andrew off, gave him Ethan's exact details, and told him to hurry. He's got a bag of money. He's not going to wait here to get his neck broken. And he'll leave, and then on some paradise island, and he'll sunbathe there, and laugh at us fools, Diana said. Andrew, to be honest, didn't care about revenge. Life had somehow started to get better. It was a pity to lose what had appeared in recent years. But on the other hand, how could he forgive all that this scoundrel had done to him? Especially after this beauty's words about cowardice, about how the scoundrel would be happy and well off. Andrew would never go to a place like this and take his family and kids out. No, not at all. He didn't like that. To find his enemy, he turned to a fellow inmate he'd served time with. I mean, the man who owed him a favor. Andrew had saved him from a very big trouble during his time in prison, and he had promised to help everyone in a difficult situation. He wasn't going to torture him much by reminding him of that debt. It was saved for some special occasion, and here it was. He didn't remember the name of this friend, and maybe he never knew it. Back in the zone, they called him the Bogeyman. Some very well-read fellow had made it up. He said that in some book there was such a character, a swindler and a swindler. But this one was the same. It wasn't hard to find him. Although the rogue didn't sit around forever either, that he was quicker somewhere. But Andrew knew where to find him, so he found him and made his request. What is it? Andrew, can I find you? A man for you. You can have 7 of them. Where does he live in the city? Or somewhere else? The hustler was excited about the assignment. If I knew, I wouldn't need you. Jessica, I give you the basic notes. You find him for me, and we go our separate ways. You don't owe me anything. Teach me. It's urgent. If you don't find it within a week, you forget this conversation ever happened, and the debt will be forgotten. Yes, I'll find it. Don't doubt it. I'll get it from under the ground, the buddy declared. Andrew began to wait. From Jennifer's house. They lived together. Andrew had promised her before the wedding not to get involved in any more stories. She had believed it, but now she was beginning to guess from her husband's condition that what she had so feared had happened. Andrew was up to no good. She tried to talk to him, to talk Andrew out of it. I don't know what you have in mind, but I don't want anything to happen to you. Let's just live quietly and peacefully already. I don't want to be alone again, It's really hard. But what to do? No way. I'm not leaving you, and I'm not starting anything. I made a promise, yeah. I'm a little nervous. But that's because they offered me a promotion at work, and I'm a little nervous about it. No, I'm not going to tell you anything yet. It's nothing. But when it becomes clear, I'll tell you right away. That's how he got rid of his wife's questions. He realized, of course, that he risked completing his revenge. Maybe it wouldn't be good for him. He felt sorry for Jennifer and Jason. He truly loved them. But he couldn't just give up his plan, unless he could walk into the light and find Ethan, and even then, he wouldn't be satisfied. But his buddy didn't let him down. 3 days later, he called to say he'd found the right man. Now what do I do? Give him something, he asked. Absolutely not. In general, forget about me about him. I'll take it from here, to be honest. Andrew didn't yet understand what he was going to do. Kill his enemy. It's not an easy thing to do, and punishable. And what good would it do to kill Ethan? Make him go to the police. Get him to confess. That way he clears his name and Ethan goes to jail, and it's not any easier. You try to put a guy like that away, he'll pay you off, that's all. Well then just meet him and tell him to pay in money, like compensation for the lost years, for his mother's health, for his own ruined life. Yeah, I guess that would be fair. And money with Jason wouldn't hurt. It was clear that this scoundrel wouldn't part with his savings so easily. I mean, you could threaten him with something. Ethan's a coward. Andrew already knew that, but he didn't know that he was so cowardly and lacking in dignity. Andrew drove up to Ethan's house, which of course was hiding from everyone, law enforcement, former creditors, Diane, and of course Andrew. He was waiting for the time to draw up the documents and easily go abroad with all the money he already considered his own. Suddenly, when everything was already in place, he cautiously walked out of the abandoned house outside the city and came face to face with Andrew. "Well, weren't you expecting me?" The ex-con said mockingly. "Well, I've come for compensation, so to speak. I'll have to share." Oh, how Ethan was frightened. How he began to ingratiate himself with promises, and he slowly crept closer and closer to his car. Or rather, not his car, but to the old Ziguli. Apparently bought for nothing for conspiracy purposes. But Andrew saw all these maneuvers and did not believe a single word. "Nice, but that's not why I'm here, you know. But you understand me too. Not in my pocket. I carry money." Ethan clasped his hands to his chest. "Now I'll go to cash it. We'll go together." Andrew took him firmly by the elbow. "But Andrew, you should not be there. You could ruin everything, but don't you realize I'm in a semi-legal position now? If he sees I'm not alone, we'll both be left with nothing. I'm almost out of nothing now. You don't think I'm getting left behind, do you?" So he moved closer and closer to the car, hoping to elude his pursuers. But Andrew managed to jump into the back seat. Ethan broke free, but there was nowhere to go. He had to go, but where and why share? He wasn't going to share a dime with anyone. He hoped to get away from Andrew somehow. He kept talking about some difficulties that wouldn't allow him to get the money right away. Andrew, already annoyed by the lies, couldn't take it anymore and grabbed Ethan by the back of the body to scare him. "I'll beat you with my own hands right now," he yelled, overly frightening his enemy. Ethan threw the steering wheel, trying to unclench the hands that were strangling him. The car, losing control, slid across the road and was literally crushed by the oncoming truck. The bodies of the two men were barely cut from the wreckage of the car. Jennifer was devastated by this news. She had just thought that life was getting better. She would finally have a family. She'd be lying if she said she was so in love with Andrew. But she believed him, believed that they would be happy, that she and her son Jason would have someone to take care of her. And the worst part was that after the funeral, she realized she was expecting her late husband's child. So now she would be a single mother with 2 children, and her second child would face the same difficult fate as Jason. Why do they have to go through all this? Why is it worth only a little bit of rejoicing, but then comes new trouble, funerals, and hard times? Once again, she was cut off from her daily life for a while, and she didn't even know how Max Irving was doing. Meanwhile, he was convalescing and improving not only his health, but also his affairs, which had fallen into disrepair during his illness. The lawyer became a regular visitor to his chambers. The first thing he did was to start divorce proceedings with his wife. Then he tried to see if he could recover his assets. After all, Ethan's death had helped him solve some of his own problems. Jennifer, on the other hand, came to work after the funeral with weight loss and sunken eyes. It was clear without explanation that things were not going well for her. "What's wrong with you?" Jennifer Max asked, seeing her after a long absence. "Are you sick?" "It's not good here without you, no. I'm not sick," she sighed and couldn't help but cry as she recounted the misfortune that had befallen her. Max tried his best to calm her down, but Jennifer only waved her away. "Come on, I guess it's my fate. There's nothing I can do about it. How are you doing? I see you're getting ready to be discharged already." "Yes, I think I could be discharged right now, but I have some personal matters to take care of first, so I'm in no hurry to go back. I'm thinking of divorcing my wife." "What about her?" Jennifer was surprised, and she couldn't help but sympathize with women who found themselves in such a situation. She knew exactly what it was like to be alone and unsupported in such a situation, but she didn't sympathize. "Well, you don't worry about her," Max waved her off. "What? She doesn't have kids. Leave her not naked and barefoot. Besides, she's got an education. She can get a job if she wants one, which I really doubt. She was used to taking care of herself, but this way she might find another husband. After all, if she doesn't drink, it's quite possible," Max said. As she started drinking, Jennifer was glad that at least she wasn't prone to that herself. "She has that weakness," Max replied without much sympathy. He knew that Diana, left without a lover and without a husband, had begun to drink more and more often, and to drink seriously. Perhaps in this way she wanted to sympathize with her ex-husband, to show how badly she felt alone, and thus to win him back. But Max did not think about anything like that. He was happy to be separated from this lying, sneaky traitor. If he hadn't known about the way she'd behaved, the way she'd planned the murder, he might have thought it wasn't worth divorcing. But now he didn't care at all what happened to her. Jennifer, on the other hand, had struggled hard to cope with her life's hardships without losing her humanity, eliciting in him fervent sympathy and empathy. During the time that she was not around, Max Irving realized that his attitude to this nurse is far beyond friendly. Only she herself was completely unconcerned. The last thing she was thinking about was her personal life. What kind of personal life could she have if she was pregnant? And sensing Max's interest in her, she tried to meet him less often. They should not be deceived and fill themselves with excessive hopes. All the more so because soon Max Irving was really discharged, and they had no opportunity to meet. They exchanged phone numbers just in case, but saw no reason to call each other. Neither had time. They both had their own things to do. Jennifer was getting ready to inherit an inheritance. At least there was one good thing about what had happened. Now she and her son had an apartment. There would be no need to wander around dormitories and spend money on living expenses. Going through the late Elizabeth's papers, she learned a lot more about Andrew's birth. He had told her that his mother had confessed before she died that he was adopted, but something more detailed apparently she hadn't had time to report. Now, from the documents Jennifer had found, she realized that her late husband and Max Irving were siblings. They had the same mother, and she died shortly after Andrew was born. Max's older son was given to an orphanage, and newborn Andrew was adopted by Elizabeth. She left him a small note, which the deceased did not find and therefore never had time to read. It informed him that he had a brother. She gave him his first and last name, and it was Max. Jennifer felt it necessary to inform Max Irving himself. The man was overjoyed by her call. "I'm sorry, Jennifer, I've been meaning to call you myself, but I've been hesitant to do so. I realize you're going through a lot of grief and worry, so I didn't dare bother you. I know it's for you and Andrew. I should be grateful to be alive," he said. "We couldn't have done otherwise," Max sighed. "I think Andrew somehow felt his kinship with me. I can't explain his involvement in any other way." "And what do you attribute your involvement to?" Annie asked. "Perhaps you felt that I cared for you," Max finally dared to ask. A relationship soon developed between them, even though Jennifer was expecting a baby. It was hard for her to understand how Max could love her, since she was pregnant by someone else. "And that doesn't affect you at all?" she asked in surprise. "But it's not from a stranger. It's from my own brother, whom I've never really gotten to know. But he helped me without knowing that we were related. And you are also very dear to me in this difficult time. I've been hesitant to tell you, knowing that you don't have time for this," Max said. Jennifer was, of course, not in the mood for any new relationship. She realized that now she was not in a position to build one. Even if she had awakened feelings for Max, it didn't give her the right to make any confessions. But it was very hard for her to be alone. She needed support. And so she didn't want to push Max away, especially after he had confessed his long-standing feelings to her. Soon after the birth of their daughter, they got married and became quite a happy family with 2 children. They were not going to stop with these 2.